Hey guys, tonight we're not just opening a dusty history book. We're pushing open a pair of immense lacquered crimson gates, stepping over a high stone threshold and gliding into a realm of profound secrecy, intricate ritual, and almost unimaginable imperial grandeur. We are journeying to the heart of imperial China, to the very center of the Middle Kingdom, as its rulers conceived it, the vast, sprawling, and deeply enigmatic Forbidden City in Beijing. Imagine yourself there, perhaps at the quiet hour of dusk, the last rays of the setting sun catching the golden-tiled roofs, turning them into rivers of fire. The air is still, carrying the faint scent of ancient cypress trees from hidden gardens, the cool metallic tang of bronze ceremonial vessels, and perhaps the even fainter, almost ghostly aroma of sandalwood incense that has permeated these ancient timbers for centuries. This was the stage upon which the grand drama of Chinese imperial power played out for nearly 500 years. A place of breathtaking beauty and stifling protocol. But within these imposing walls, largely unseen and often misunderstood by the outside world, lived a unique and essential class of imperial servants. Thousands of them, whose lives were a paradox of profound sacrifice and potential power, the palace eunuchs. You probably wouldn't survive your first week within these crimson walls without an absolutely impeccable, almost telepathic sense of courtly etiquette, an uncanny ability to become virtually invisible on command, especially when an imperial temper flared, and a very, very good understanding of exactly who not to make accidental eye contact with, particularly if you were one of the thousands of uniquely altered individuals whose often secret lives we are about to gently uncover. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as we prepare to navigate the intricate corridors of this imperial past, I'd be truly delighted to know where in the world you're all joining me from tonight. Please do drop your location and local time in the comments below. It's always a genuine pleasure to see how far these sleepy historical narratives manage to travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself approaching from the south, the traditional and most auspicious direction, facing the formidable Meridian Gate Wumen, the main, imposing entrance to the Zijin Cheng, the Purple Forbidden City. The name itself whispers of exclusivity and cosmic significance. Purple refers to the North Star, Polaris, which in Chinese cosmology was considered the home of the celestial emperor, the divine counterpart to the earthly son of heaven. The Forbidden City, therefore, was conceived as his terrestrial palace, the pivot around which the entire empire, and indeed the cosmos, was believed to revolve. And forbidden it certainly was. The Forbidden City in Beijing, initially constructed under the orders of the Yongle Emperor of the Ming Dynasty in the early 15th century, completed around 1420, served as the primary imperial palace and the ceremonial and political heart of Chinese government for almost 500 years, through the Ming and the subsequent Qing dynasty, until the abdication of Puyi, the last emperor, in 1912. For virtually all of this time, access to its inner precincts was strictly prohibited to ordinary Chinese citizens and most of the outside world. To enter without explicit imperial permission was to risk summary execution. It was the ultimate gated community, and the gates were guarded by more than just stern-faced imperial guards. They were guarded by centuries of tradition, ritual, and an almost palpable aura of sacred imperial power. You didn't just casually drop by the Forbidden City for a cup of tea and a chat with the emperor. You'd be more likely to lose your head than find the imperial tea caddy. As you pass in your sleepy imagination, through the 5 arches of the Meridian Gate, the central arch reserved for the emperor alone. Of course, you enter a succession of vast, stone-paved courtyards. The scale is almost overwhelming, designed to make any individual feel small and insignificant in the face of imperial majesty. This is the outer court, the more public and ceremonial section of the palace. Here, the emperor conducted the grand rituals of state, held audiences with his ministers and officials, received tribute from vassal states, and promulgated his edicts to the empire. Dominating these courtyards are the 3 great halls. Raised on a magnificent 3-tiered marble terrace, the Hall of Supreme Harmony Taiheidian, the largest and most important ceremonial hall, where major events like enthronements, imperial weddings, and winter solstice ceremonies took place. Behind it, the smaller hall of central harmony, Zhonghe Dian, where the emperor would rest and prepare before these grand occasions. And finally, the hall of preserving harmony, Baiouhe Dian, used for imperial banquets and during the Qing dynasty as the venue for the final stage of the prestigious imperial civil service examinations. The architecture all around you is a symphony in imperial yellow for the glazed roof tiles, a color reserved exclusively for the emperor, vermilion red for the massive wooden pillars and walls, symbolizing good fortune and imperial authority, and gleaming white marble, elaborately carved dragon motifs, the ultimate symbol of imperial power, are everywhere, coiling around pillars, adorning rooftops, writhing on ceremonial ramps. The entire complex is laid out with a breathtaking, almost obsessive symmetricality along a central north-south axis, a physical manifestation of ancient Chinese cosmological beliefs about balance, harmony, and the emperor's role as the central pivot linking heaven, earth, and humankind. Historians and architectural scholars continue to debate the full extent of purely functional design considerations versus deeply symbolic, ritualistic, or cosmological principles, including the subtle but pervasive influence of feng shui in dictating the precise layout, orientation, specific dimensions, and even the prescribed number of decorative elements on the various halls, gates, and courtyards within the Forbidden City. Every stone, every eave, every painted detail was intended to reinforce the emperor's supreme and divinely ordained status. It was less a home and more a meticulously constructed diagram of the universe, with the Son of Heaven at its absolute center. The Wi-Fi signal in a place built with such a focus on ancient cosmology and thick stone walls was probably atrocious, which might explain why so many imperial edicts had to be delivered by hand. But our sleepy journey tonight is leading us deeper. Beyond the grand, sun-drenched ceremonial spaces of the outer court, we pass through further imposing gates, perhaps the gate of heavenly purity Chenkingmen, which traditionally separated the outer court from the inner court, and the atmosphere begins to subtly shift. This is the inner court, also known as the Back Palace Hogong. This was the private, residential heart of the Forbidden City, the domestic world of the emperor himself, his empress Huanghu, his numerous consorts and concubines who could number in the hundreds, or even thousands, depending on the emperor's imperial vigor and the period, his young, unmarried children, princes and princesses, and often the powerful Empress Dowager, the emperor's mother or grandmother. Here, the scale of the individual palaces and courtyards might be slightly more intimate, arranged with a greater degree of privacy, interspersed with secluded rock gardens, tranquil fish ponds, and ancient, gnarled trees. But the opulence, the intricate detail, and the rigid adherence to protocol were no less intense. This was a world of profound seclusion, a gilded cage for many of its female inhabitants, a place of whispered conversations in silken chambers, rustling robes in silent corridors, meticulously observed daily rituals, and often intense personal rivalries and hidden intrigues. And it is here, in these most private, most sensitive, and most jealously guarded precincts of the Forbidden City, that the Imperial eunuchs played their most indispensable and pervasive role. As you drift through these inner courtyards, you might begin to notice them of figures in simple but neat robes, moving silently and efficiently about their duties. They might be carrying trays of food, delivering messages, tending to braziers, or simply standing in watchful attendance at a doorway. They are a ubiquitous presence, yet often deliberately unobtrusive, their expressions usually carefully neutral. There were thousands of them. A quirky or fringe tidbit, often cited, is the legendary room count of the Forbidden City tradition holds that it contains 9,999 rooms, or sometimes stated as 9,999 and a half rooms. This number was supposedly chosen to be just one fraction short of the mythical 10,000 rooms believed to exist in the Jade Emperor's heavenly palace, as the earthly Son of Heaven would not presume to possess a dwelling equal to or grander than that of the supreme celestial ruler. Whether this number is an exact tally or a symbolic representation of almost perfect or immeasurable vastness is a matter for gentle debate, but it certainly conveys the bewildering scale of the place. Imagine trying to manage the spring cleaning for nearly 10,000 rooms, each filled with priceless artifacts and imperial tempers. You'd need a very large, very dedicated, and very discreet staff. This staff, particularly in the inner court, was composed almost entirely of eunuchs. Their unique physical state, a result of the painful and irreversible act of castration, was the absolute prerequisite for their deep penetration into these inner sanctums. They were deemed sexually neutral and therefore safe to serve in the constant intimate presence of the imperial women, the empress, the consorts, the concubines, without posing any threat to the purity of the imperial bloodline or the strict Confucian codes of female chastity and seclusion. They were the oil in the imperial clockwork, the often unseen but essential hands that attended to every detail of the emperor's private life and the functioning of his vast household. Their lives, lived out within these crimson walls, were a unique paradox of profound personal sacrifice and, for a select and fortunate few, the potential for extraordinary, if often hidden, power and influence. It is their secret lives, their individual journeys, their daily routines, their hopes, their fears, and the complex, often contradictory world they inhabited, that we are here to gently explore as you drift ever deeper into a state of peaceful relaxation. We've taken our first imaginary steps beyond the imposing Meridian Gate, gliding through the vast ceremonial courtyards of the outer court and into the more secluded, private world of the inner court of the Forbidden City. It is here, in the residential palaces of the emperor, his empress, and his legion of consorts and concubines, that the imperial eunuchs played their most intimate and indispensable roles. But this unique position, this unparalleled access to the very heart of imperial privacy and power, came at an almost unimaginable personal cost. To serve in these inner sanctums, these men had to undergo the drastic and irreversible procedure of castration. This brings us to a fundamental and undeniably uncomfortable question. Why? Why would any individual, or more often, the parents of a young boy, make such a cutting choice? What desperate circumstances or slim hopes could possibly motivate such a profound and painful sacrifice? The answers are woven from a grim tapestry of extreme poverty, a sliver of desperate ambition, prevailing societal norms, and the unique, often brutal logic of the imperial Chinese system. The practice of employing eunuchs in royal or imperial courts was not unique to China, nor did it begin with the Ming or Qing dynasties. It has a very long history, dating back thousands of years in China itself, to at least the Shang and Zhou dynasties' 2nd and 1st millennia BCE, and it also existed in various other ancient and medieval civilizations across the Middle East, the Byzantine Empire, and parts of Africa and Europe. The primary rationale, especially in contexts involving large harems or secluded women's quarters, was almost always the same: to provide a class of male servants who were deemed safe, incapable of procreating and thus posing no threat to the legitimacy of royal succession or the chastity of the ruler's female family members. In imperial China, where the purity of the Dragon Throne's bloodline was of paramount cosmic and political importance, this function of the eunuch as a neutral guardian and servant of the inner court became deeply entrenched and highly institutionalized. We require attendance for the palace of tranquil longevity. An imperial decree might state, and it is imperative they be unburdened by the usual dynastic ambitions that intact males sometimes harbor, for the harmony of the empire, and so the imperial gene pool remains commendably unmuddied. But for the individuals who became eunuchs, and for their families, the motivations were rarely about upholding abstract principles of dynastic purity. Overwhelmingly, the most common driving force was extreme, soul-crushing poverty. The primary motivation for individuals or their families choosing the difficult and dangerous path of castration for potential palace service in imperial China was almost invariably dire, often inescapable about poverty. The desperate hope was that the son, by entering this unique form of imperial service, would gain secure employment, avoid starvation for himself and his kin, and perhaps, if incredibly fortunate and skillful, achieve a position of influence that could bring desperately needed wealth, status, and crucial support back to his struggling family. Imagine a peasant family in a remote, drought-stricken province of 17th or 18th century China. Their crops have failed. They are burdened by heavy taxes. Perhaps their land has been seized by a corrupt local official or a powerful landlord. They face starvation, a future of unremitting hardship with no apparent escape. In such circumstances, the distant, glittering, forbidden city, with its rumored opportunities for those who served the Son of Heaven, might seem like the only possible lifeline, however perilous. The prospect of having a son enter palace service, even as a eunuch, offered a sliver of hope. At the very least, a eunuch in the palace would be fed, clothed, and sheltered, basic necessities that might be otherwise unattainable for his family. And if, by some miracle of fate or personal talent, he managed to rise through the eunuch ranks, he could potentially achieve a level of wealth and influence far beyond the wildest dreams of his impoverished village. He could send money back to his parents and siblings, perhaps buy them land, secure positions for other male relatives not as eunuchs, necessarily but in other capacities if his influence was great enough, and generally elevate the family's social standing. It was a terrible gamble, a profound sacrifice made by parents who saw no other way to save their family from utter destitution. You can almost hear the agonizing whispers in a humble mud brick hut. Little Wei is quick and clever. If we do this, perhaps he can escape this life. Perhaps he can help us all. The choice was often between probable starvation for the entire family, or the certain, painful sacrifice of one son for the potential salvation of the rest. Beyond this stark economic desperation, for some individuals, particularly as they grew older and perhaps saw the limited opportunities available to them in the rigidly hierarchical society outside the palace, there might also have been an element of personal ambition. However deeply buried or rationalized, the annals of Chinese history, and certainly the popular tales and operas, were filled with stories of eunuchs who had wielded immense power, figures who had been the trusted confidants of emperors, who had controlled vast palace departments, influenced state policy, and lived lives of incredible luxury. While these were always the exceptional few, the very possibility, however remote, could act as a potent lure for someone with intelligence, drive, and a willingness to take the ultimate irreversible risk. It was a unique, if deeply compromised, path to the very epicenter of imperial power, a path entirely closed to ordinary men from humble backgrounds who had not made the cutting choice. In earlier Chinese dynasties, castration had also been used as a severe legal punishment for certain crimes, such as treason or egregious offenses against the imperial family. These punished eunuchs might then be forced into menial servitude within the palace or other state institutions. The great Han Dynasty historian Sima Qian, for example, is one of the most famous individuals to have suffered this fate. He chose castration over execution after offending Emperor Wu, driven by his determination to complete his monumental historical work. The Shiji records of the Grand Historian. However, by the time of the Ming 1368-1644 and Qing 1644-1912 dynasties, which are most associated with the Forbidden City in Beijing, the vast majority of palace eunuchs were not criminals who had been forcibly castrated as punishment. They were, in a sense, volunteers, either having made the decision themselves as adults, though this was rarer, as the operation was far more dangerous and the recovery more difficult for mature men, or much more commonly, having been castrated as young boys, often between the ages of about 8 and 12, at the instigation of their parents or other guardians who saw it as their only hope for a better future. There were also instances where families with existing connections to the palace bureaucracy, perhaps with a relative already serving successfully as a eunuch, might dedicate a son to this life of service, seeing it as an established, if unusual, path to familial advancement and security within the imperial system. In some cases, particularly during times of war, famine, or social upheaval, orphaned boys or young male captives might also be castrated and brought into palace service, their fates decided for them by those in authority. The physical act of castration itself, often referred to by various euphemisms such as purifying the body, Jing Shen, or becoming a palace person, Ru Gong, was almost invariably a brutal, dangerous, and deeply traumatic experience. It was not typically performed by skilled medical surgeons in anything resembling a sterile or controlled environment. Instead, it was the domain of specialized, often hereditary, cutters, Daozi Jiang Daozi Jiang, sometimes themselves eunuchs, who operated outside the formal medical establishment, often in secrecy and in rather squalid conditions. These practitioners used crude, unsterilized knives, small curved blades, or razors. Anesthetics were rudimentary at best, perhaps involving opium or other herbal concoctions to dull the senses, but the pain would have been excruciating. The procedure for palace eunuchs in the Ming and Qing dynasties generally involved the removal of both the testicles and the entire penis, a complete emasculation known as Qiugen Kugen. Removing the root, the risk of hemorrhage, severe infection, gangrene, urinary complications like fistulas or strictures, and death was incredibly high. The exact mortality rates associated with the castration procedure in different periods of Chinese history, and how these might have varied based on factors such as the skill and experience of the individual cutter. The age and prior physical health of the boy or man undergoing the operation, or the nature of the post-operative care, which was often minimal or based on folk remedies, are exceptionally difficult to ascertain with any degree of precision due to the secrecy often surrounding the practice and the lack of comprehensive historical records on such a sensitive matter. But all indications are that they were appallingly high. Many simply did not survive the operation or its immediate aftermath. For those who did survive, a long and agonizing recovery period followed. This often involved being confined to a specially heated room for many weeks, sometimes up to 100 days, being unable to drink water for several days immediately after the operation, a misguided attempt to prevent urination from infecting the wound, and having the urethra kept open with a pewter plug, a goose feather quill, or a small bamboo or silver tube until the wound began to heal and scar tissue formed. The pain, the constant risk of life-threatening infection, the development of lifelong urinary problems like incontinence or painful strictures, and the profound psychological trauma of this bodily mutilation and the loss of manhood as defined by their society are almost impossible for us to fully comprehend from our modern vantage point. And yet, despite these almost unimaginable horrors, tens of thousands of individuals, or their families on their behalf, made this cutting choice. It speaks volumes about the crushing weight of poverty that could drive people to such an extreme measure, the desperate hope for survival or a better life, however compromised that the imperial palace seemed to offer. A particularly poignant and quirky or fringe tidbit that underscores the deep cultural and spiritual significance attached to bodily integrity, even for those who underwent this process, is the well-documented practice of eunuchs meticulously preserving their severed genitals, the testes and penis, collectively known as their baobao, or treasure. These would be carefully dried, sometimes treated with preservatives or perfumes, and then stored, often wrapped in silk, in a sealed jar or a small, ornate box. It was profoundly believed that upon death, a eunuch would need to be buried with his bao so that he could present it to Yama, the king of hell or other guardians of the afterlife, and thus be judged and allowed to be reborn as a whole or complete man in his next incarnation, or to properly join his ancestors. This treasure was thus incredibly important to them, not just as a physical remnant, but as a key to their spiritual future and their posthumous identity. Its loss was considered a spiritual catastrophe. The bayo also sometimes served as a kind of identity document or proof of their eunuch status within the palace, and there are even accounts of powerful eunuchs using their treasure as a form of collateral, a pawn in palace power plays, or a precious item to be bequeathed to their adopted eunuch sons. The layers of meaning attached to these preserved parts are both fascinating and deeply melancholic. Don't forget to update your will, Brother Wu. One aging eunuch might remind another, make sure your bao is bequeathed to someone trustworthy who will ensure it's properly interred with you. We wouldn't want you showing up in the underworld incomplete. The paperwork alone would be a nightmare. The path to becoming an imperial eunuch was, therefore, a path of almost unimaginable pain, profound risk, and irrevocable sacrifice, a choice almost always born more of utter desperation than of any genuine desire. It was the gateway to a unique and deeply paradoxical world, a world that offered the slimmest possibility of security and even power, but at the cost of one's very physical integrity and a life lived out in the gilded, but often treacherous and emotionally barren. Cage of the Forbidden City. The agonizing ordeal of purifying the body, the painful and perilous journey into eunuch status, has been endured. Our young novice, having somehow survived both the cutter's knife and the perilous recovery period, now stands perhaps still weak and deeply traumatized, at the very threshold of a new and utterly bewildering existence within the crimson-walled labyrinth of the Forbidden City. His old life, his old identity in many ways, has been irrevocably severed, left behind in the impoverished village or the desperate circumstances that propelled him here. A new life, a secret life of service, protocol, and constant watchfulness is just beginning. What awaited these novices, these new recruits into the ranks of Imperial servitude, as they took their first tentative and likely terrified steps into the heart of Chinese Imperial power? Their entry into the palace was not a simple matter of clocking in for a new job. It was an immersion into a total institution, a world with its own arcane laws, its own unforgiving hierarchies, and a steep, often brutal, learning curve. Let's gently follow our young eunuch as he begins the arduous process of learning the imperial ropes. Upon formally entering palace service, often as a boy or a very young man, though some were castrated and entered service as adults, this was less common and often more dangerous. The new eunuch would typically be assigned to a specific department or section within the vast eunuch bureaucracy that managed the inner court. Newly recruited eunuchs in the Forbidden City, particularly during the Ming and Qing dynasties, generally underwent a period of rigorous, if often informal, training, often lasting for several years. This instruction covered a wide range of essential knowledge, from the most minute and seemingly trivial points of palace etiquette and courtly protocol to the specific job skills required for their future roles. This crucial period of apprenticeship and acclimatization was almost invariably supervised by senior, more experienced eunuchs, who served as masters, mentors, and often as very strict, unyielding disciplinarians. This was the imperial onboarding process, and it was designed to strip away any lingering individuality and mold the novice into a perfectly functioning, obedient, and ideally, unnoticeable cog in the vast imperial machine. Forget welcome packets and team-building exercises. This was more like Survive and Obey 101, with a very high failure rate if you didn't pay attention. Young Lin, a grizzled old supervising eunuch, might rasp, "Your bow to the third-ranking concubine's pet pug was 2 degrees too shallow this morning." Another such egregious breach of protocol, and you'll be personally responsible for polishing all 432 bronze hinges in the western palaces, with a single sow's bristle. Do I make myself clear? A profoundly important aspect of this early experience for many new eunuchs was the adoption system that was deeply embedded within the eunuch community. Since eunuchs were, by their very nature, unable to have their own biological children and thus continue their ancestral lines in the traditional Confucian sense, a matter of great cultural and spiritual importance in China, they often created their own intricate family-like structures and lineages within the palace. A senior, established eunuch, perhaps one with some rank and influence, would adopt one or more younger or newer eunuchs as his Yeezy or adopted son. This relationship was often formalized, and the adopted son would refer to his mentor as Shafu Shifu, or master teacher, or sometimes even more intimately as father. Oh, this eunuch father would provide his sons with practical guidance. Instruction in palace ways, a measure of protection from bullying or exploitation by other eunuchs if he had the clout, and, most importantly, patronage, using his influence to help his sons secure better assignments, avoid unpleasant duties, and hopefully advance within the eunuch hierarchy. In return, the adopted eunuch's son owed his eunuch father absolute loyalty, obedience, respect, and often a significant portion of any future earnings, gifts, or illicit gains he might acquire. These adoptive eunuch families, sometimes spanning several generations, formed the backbone of powerful factions and loyalty networks within the eunuch establishment, providing a crucial sense of kinship, mutual support, and political leverage in a highly competitive, often isolating, and inherently insecure environment. For a young boy, often forcibly separated from his own birth family by immense distance and the unbridgeable chasm of his physical alteration, his eunuch father could become the most important and formative figure in his young life, a complex blend of mentor, employer, protector, and sometimes a surprisingly paternal or, conversely, a terrifyingly strict and demanding authority figure. The initial phase of training, sometimes referred to as suxiu sushi, or palace study or basic learning, was relentless and focused on achieving absolute precision in every aspect of behavior. The most fundamental and all-encompassing aspect was mastering the Byzantine complexities of palace etiquette and courtly protocol. This was not just about knowing which teacup to use or how to address a minor prince, though those were certainly part of it. It was about internalizing an incredibly detailed and largely unwritten code of conduct that governed every conceivable interaction, every gesture, every word, every moment of one's existence within the imperial precincts. There were precise rules for how to walk often a specific, almost gliding or shuffling gait, with eyes downcast and hands respectfully clasped or hidden in sleeves, how to stand never with one's back directly to a superior, an imperial portrait, or an empty throne, how to kneel, when and how deeply to kowtow the full prostration, forehead touching the ground, used before the emperor, empress, empress dowager, and other high-ranking individuals, with subtle variations in form depending on the recipient's rank, how to speak when to speak at all, what tone of voice to use, what elaborate honorifics and titles to employ for every conceivable rank of imperial family member. Official or senior eunuch. Getting this wrong could be a capital offense, metaphorically or literally. How to avert one's gaze respectfully. How to handle imperial objects always with two hands. Never turning one's back on them. How to enter and leave a room silently and without causing a draft. Every single gesture, every word, every breath almost, was laden with significance and subject to the strictest protocol. Mistakes were not tolerated and were often met with immediate and harsh punishment. A sharp reprimand from a superior. A painful beating with a bamboo rod administered by other eunuchs. Demotion to even more unpleasant and demeaning duties, or in cases of egregious breaches, especially in the imperial presence. Far worse, it was a process of learning by rote, by constant, fearful observation, and by the sharp sting of correction. Beyond general deportment, novice eunuchs had to memorize the bewildering and vast layout of the Forbidden City. This wasn't just about knowing the way to the main audience halls. It was about learning the names, locations, and specific functions of hundreds of different palaces, pavilions, courtyards, gardens, gates, and residential quarters. They needed to understand the intricate network of corridors and alleyways, and importantly, which areas were permissible for them to enter based on their rank and current assignment, and which were strictly off-limits, on pain of severe punishment. Getting lost was not merely an inconvenience, it could be a serious offense. They also had to learn the specific, often changing, routes for delivering messages or goods within the palace, routes that might be altered depending on who was in residence in a particular quarter, what ceremonies were taking place, or even the time of day. No, little pine needle. A supervising eunuch might exasperate. You cannot take the imperial consort's laundry basket through the courtyard of ancestral contemplation during the hour of the sacred carp feeding. You must use the alley of humble compliance. Do you want to cause a cosmic imbalance and ruin the emperor's appetite for his evening bowl of bird's nest soup? While some eunuchs, if they displayed particular talents or had influential patrons, might eventually receive more specialized training. Perhaps in music, the imperial court often had its own eunuch opera troupes and orchestras. In painting or calligraphy, in the care of imperial gardens or menageries, as skilled artisans in palace workshops producing exquisite lacquerware or jade carvings, or even in the complex workings of imported European clocks and automata during the later Qing dynasty, the vast majority of novices would begin their careers with grueling and often deeply demeaning menial labor. Cleaning was an endless, Sisyphean task in a palace of such monumental scale and obsessive standards of imperial perfection. They would be sweeping the endless flagstone courtyards, dusting the thousands of ornate pieces of furniture and intricate carved wooden screens, polishing the hundreds of bronze incense burners and ritual vessels until they gleamed, scrubbing floors, and maintaining the general tidiness and order of the imperial living and working spaces. Fetching and carrying was another constant, demanding physical chore. They would haul heavy buckets of water from wells or cisterns for bathing, drinking, and cleaning, as sophisticated piped water systems were non-existent for most areas and most inhabitants. They would carry massive loads of firewood or charcoal for the hundreds, if not thousands, of stoves and braziers that heated the vast, drafty halls in the bitter Beijing winters. They transported trays laden with food from the sprawling, distant imperial kitchens to the various dining halls and private residential apartments, often having to run to ensure the dishes arrived sufficiently warm for the imperial palate. They ran messages, often just verbal commands or small folded notes, from one end of the sprawling complex to another, serving as the human internal communication system. They might be assigned to guarding doorways or gates for long, monotonous, and often bone-chillingly cold or swelteringly hot shifts, expected to remain perfectly alert, motionless, and silent unless announcing an arrival with the precise, prescribed vocal intonations and unflinching adherence to protocol. Or they might find themselves in the service of low-ranking concubines, very distant imperial relatives, or even as personal servants to more senior, established eunuchs, performing all manner of personal and domestic chores, whatever tasks were deemed too lowly, too tedious, or too unpleasant for more experienced or higher-ranking hands. Life for these palace novices was governed by unrelenting, harsh discipline and the absolute, unassailable authority of the eunuch hierarchy. They were at the very bottom rung of a very tall, very slippery ladder, subject to the orders and often the unpredictable whims, tempers, and even cruelties of every single eunuch ranked above them. The environment was one of constant observation, intense scrutiny, and pervasive fear of making a mistake or attracting negative attention. The degree of literacy and formal textual education provided to these ordinary, low-ranking eunuchs beyond the rote memorization of essential palace protocols and perhaps some basic characters needed for their specific duties, like being able to identify the markings on different types of tribute silk, imperial tea caddies, or palace storeroom labels, and how much this might have varied between different dynasties, for example. Ming eunuchs are sometimes noted in historical sources for achieving, as a group, higher levels of literacy and administrative skill than some of their later Qing counterparts. Although this is a broad generalization or based on an individual eunuch's perceived aptitude or the influence of his adoptive eunuch father, is not consistently clear from all surviving historical sources. For many, the imperial ropes they learned were less about mastering classical texts and more about internalizing a kind of institutional muscle memory, an ingrained, almost instinctive understanding of how to survive, how to serve, and how to remain as inconspicuous as possible within this unique, high-stakes, and often terrifyingly unforgiving world. This initial period of training and intensely menial service was a profound and often brutal process of acclimation, indoctrination, and, in many ways, a systematic stripping away of their previous identities. It was designed to instill unquestioning obedience, unwavering loyalty to the emperor and the imperial system, and to mold them into the perfectly functioning, utterly reliable, and ideally completely unnoticeable cogs necessary for the smooth, silent running of the vast imperial machine. It was a harsh and often deeply dehumanizing apprenticeship, a trial by fire and endless floor scrubbing, but it was the only path forward within the Crimson Walls. Those who endured it, who learned the intricate rules of the game, who managed to find a patron or display some particular skill, and who perhaps possessed a significant measure of luck and cunning, might then begin the slow, arduous, and always precarious climb up the eunuch power ladder, hoping for a life of greater comfort, perhaps a little security, and for a very ambitious few, a chance to grasp at the elusive levers of real influence. The Forbidden City had now fully claimed them, body and soul, and their secret lives within its guarded, silent precincts had truly, irrevocably begun. our young eunuch novice, having survived the initial gauntlet of palace training and the crushing monotony of menial labor, is now beginning to understand the lay of the land within the Forbidden City. He's learned that being a eunuch is not a singular state of being, but rather the entry point into a vast, complex, and rigidly stratified society all its own. The eunuch establishment was a world teeming with its own intricate hierarchies, its own career paths of a sort, its own internal politics, and its own dizzying ladder of ranks, titles, and responsibilities. Ascending this ladder, moving from the anonymous drudgery of the lowest rungs to a position of even modest comfort, let alone one of significant influence, was the lifelong ambition of many eunuchs. It was a journey that required not just diligence and obedience, but often a keen understanding of power dynamics, a talent for navigating treacherous personal relationships, and a healthy dose of luck. Let's now gently trace the potential rungs of this unique power ladder, exploring the different levels of service and the varying degrees of authority within the eunuch bureaucracy that kept the imperial household turning. The eunuch establishment within the Chinese imperial palace, particularly during its most populous periods in dynasties like the Tang and most notably in the Ming, was an incredibly highly organized and often sprawling bureaucracy. It possessed a formal, multi-layered hierarchy of ranks, scores of specialized departments and sub-departments managing every conceivable aspect of palace life from imperial laundry to state secrets, and it offered, at least in theory, a path for advancement for those with skill, ambition, or the right connections. Though this path was often exceptionally narrow, notoriously treacherous, and heavily dependent on factors far beyond mere competence or years of service. At its absolute peak, especially during certain reigns of the Ming dynasty, the total number of eunuchs serving in the Forbidden City in Beijing and in other secondary imperial residences and affiliated institutions could reportedly swell to an astonishing 70,000, or by some more extreme historical estimates, even approach 100,000 individuals. Even if these higher figures are exaggerated, numbers in the tens of thousands were certainly common for long stretches of imperial history. The later Qing dynasty, having witnessed and studied what they perceived as the dangerous excesses of Ming eunuch power, generally made concerted efforts to keep the numbers significantly lower, perhaps averaging around 2,000 to 3,000 at any given time. But even this represented a very considerable specialized workforce dedicated solely to the imperial household. It wasn't just a handful of personal attendants, it was a veritable shadow administration, an entire city of servants operating within the walls of the imperial city. Trying to remember everyone's specific title, their exact rank, and precisely how many degrees one needed to bow when encountering them in a dimly lit corridor must have been a constant source of anxiety and a full-time job for one's memory. Is that Chief Attendant Eunuch Wang from the Department of Imperial Canary Seed Procurement? Third Subdivision, or merely Deputy Assistant Underscrubber Wang from the Courtyard of Eternal Dust Bunnies? The cut of their silk robe is subtly different, but the level of kowtow required is critically distinct, and my knees are already feeling the strain of 1,000 previous prostrations today. At the very bottom of this immense eunuch power pyramid were the vast legions of those performing the most basic, unskilled, and physically demanding labor. These were the countless cleaners who kept the endless flagstone courtyards meticulously swept, the ornate halls free of dust, and the imperial latrines, well, as pleasant as an imperial latrine could be. They were the water carriers, hauling heavy buckets from wells or cisterns to supply the needs of the thousands of palace inhabitants. They were the fuel haulers, bringing in firewood or charcoal for the hundreds of stoves and braziers that heated the vast, drafty halls during the bitter Beijing winters. They were the stable hands tending to the imperial horses, the gardeners toiling in the meticulously manicured imperial gardens, though the more artistic aspects of garden design might be overseen by higher-ranking eunuchs or even scholar officials. They were the lamplighters ensuring the palace was illuminated, and the general drudges performing 1,000 other thankless, repetitive tasks. Their lives were characterized by hard, unrelenting physical work, strict discipline, often cramped and uncomfortable communal living conditions in the eunuch dormitories Jingxi, meager rations and stipends, and very little hope of significant personal advancement or recognition. They were the largely invisible, almost anonymous foundation upon which the entire glittering edifice of imperial household life rested. For these eunuchs at the lowest rungs, their secret life was most likely a secret. Fervent wish for an extra bowl of congee at the end of a long day, or perhaps just for a moment to sit down without being barked at by a supervising eunuch. Moving up a step, or perhaps several rungs. On this intricate ladder, we find eunuchs occupying a wide array of mid-level positions. These roles often required more specific skills, a greater degree of education or literacy however acquired, a higher level of discretion, or some measure of supervisory responsibility over those below them. These might include personal attendants Taijin Taijin. This term, which in the Ming dynasty specifically referred to the prestigious heads of the 12 main eunuch directorates, later often became a more general, if still somewhat honorific, term for eunuchs, particularly those assigned to serve individual members of the imperial family. This included not just the emperor, empress, and empress dowager, but also the numerous imperial princes and princesses, the emperor's high-ranking consorts and favored concubines, and other imperial relatives who resided within the palace precincts. These positions required immense tact, an ability to anticipate unspoken needs, a talent for navigating complex interpersonal dynamics, and often the ability to be a silent, unobtrusive, and utterly discreet presence. Clerks, scribes, and archivists. Eunuchs who were literate and skilled in calligraphy and record-keeping would find employment in the various palace administrative offices. They would be responsible for managing accounts for different departments, drafting official documents and correspondence within the inner court, maintaining meticulous inventories of palace treasures, silks, medicines, or tribute goods, or organizing and preserving the vast imperial libraries and archives. This was vital intellectual labor. Supervisors and foremen. These eunuchs would oversee teams of lower-ranking eunuchs in specific tasks or departments. For example, a supervisory eunuch might be in charge of a section of the imperial kitchens, which were a massive operation in themselves, preparing hundreds of dishes daily for the imperial family and the palace staff, or oversee the maintenance of a particular palace garden, manage the imperial stables and the care of the emperor's prized horses, or direct the activities of the numerous palace workshops that produced luxury goods like porcelain, lacquerware, or embroidered silks for court use. Specialized craftsmen, performers, and ritual assistants. As we've noted, some eunuchs received highly specialized training and became skilled musicians, opera singers. The imperial court often maintained its own eunuch opera troupes which were highly regarded: painters, calligraphers, jade carvers, or even expert clockmakers. Particularly in the later Qing dynasty, when intricate European clocks and automata became fashionable at court, others would be trained as ritual assistants, meticulously learning the complex procedures for the endless cycle of imperial ceremonies and sacrifices, ensuring every detail was performed with absolute correctness. These specialized roles could offer a degree of creative expression, a more comfortable existence than general menial labor, and sometimes a path to greater imperial favor and influence if their particular talents pleased the emperor or other powerful figures. And then, at the very apex of the eunuch hierarchy, were the eunuch elite, the figures who had successfully navigated the treacherous currents of palace politics, gained the deep and abiding trust of the emperor or other key imperial figures like a powerful empress dowager, and had risen to head the major palace directorates or departments, or to serve as the emperor's most intimate confidants and advisors. A quirky or fringe tidbit that highlights the internal social structures they created is that these powerful senior eunuchs often solidified their positions and extended their influence by adopting promising younger eunuchs, creating extensive and powerful artificial lineage and patronage networks that mirrored traditional Confucian family structures, which were otherwise denied to them due to their inability to have biological descendants. These eunuch fathers would mentor, protect, and relentlessly promote their sons to key positions within the eunuch bureaucracy and in close proximity to the imperial family. In return, these adopted sons owed their eunuch father absolute loyalty, unwavering obedience, and often a significant share of any future earnings, gifts, or illicit gains they might acquire. These intricate eunuch family factions and loyalty networks could be incredibly influential, often forming power blocks that vied with each other and with the outer court officials for dominance. My adopted son, Little Phoenix. A supremely powerful eunuch director might proudly remark, shows exceptional promise in the delicate art of accidentally misplacing troublesome memorials from those pesky Confucian censors. With a bit more seasoning, and my continued guidance, he might one day rise to be the Assistant Deputy Grand Eunuch in charge of strategic document shredding. The future is bright if you know which documents to shred and for whom. Some of the most powerful eunuch-led institutions, particularly during the Ming Dynasty, included the Directorate of Ceremonial Silijian Silijian. This was arguably the most influential eunuch agency. Its director often acted as the emperor's de facto personal secretary, controlling the vital flow of official documents memorials from ministers to and from the throne, drafting imperial edicts, and, most significantly, sometimes wielding the imperial vermilion approval brush in the emperor's name, especially if the emperor was young, ill, or simply disinclined to handle the tedious details of daily governance himself. This gave the head of the Silijian enormous, almost unparalleled, power over state policy and appointments. The Imperial Household Department, Neiwufu in the Qing Dynasty, with similar structures under different names in the Ming. This was a vast and sprawling bureaucracy in its own right, responsible for managing all the internal affairs of the entire palace complex, its immense finances, the procurement and distribution of all supplies from rice and silk to firewood and writing brushes, the management of palace personnel including other eunuchs and palace maids, the upkeep and construction of palace buildings, and attending to the personal needs and lavish expenses of the entire imperial family. The head of this department was an immensely powerful figure, controlling vast resources and patronage. Various other important directorates and offices managed the imperial studs and pastures vital for the military and imperial transport. The numerous imperial workshops producing everything from porcelain and textiles to weaponry and furniture. The palace granaries and treasuries, and even specialized units of palace guards responsible for security within the deeply restricted inner court. Promotion and demotion within this intricate hierarchy were constant preoccupations and sources of intense competition. Advancement could come through many years of diligent and demonstrably loyal service. Through displaying exceptional skill in a particular area, whether it was administration, a craft, or simply an uncanny ability to anticipate the emperor's unspoken desires, or by catching the favorable and sustained attention of a powerful superior eunuch or an influential imperial personage. However, the political landscape of the Forbidden City was notoriously fickle. Imperial favor could shift as quickly and unpredictably as the wind. A eunuch who was basking in power and influence one day could find himself utterly disgraced, stripped of his rank and wealth, demoted to the most demeaning duties, exiled to a remote and unpleasant frontier post, or even facing imprisonment or a painful execution the next. This often happened as a result of shifting factional struggles within the eunuch establishment itself. A change in imperial whim or a new emperor ascending the throne with his own favored eunuchs, or successful machinations by rival scholar officials in the outer court who were always eager to see powerful eunuchs fall. The latter was exceptionally tall, offering breathtaking views from the top, but it was also incredibly slippery, precariously balanced, and there were absolutely no safety nets at the bottom. The insignia and privileges that came with different eunuch ranks were meticulously observed and jealously guarded. Higher-ranking eunuchs would wear finer silk robes of specific, prescribed colors and patterns, distinctive hats or caps often adorned with precious buttons, peacock feathers, or other insignia indicating their grade, and they might carry specific symbols of their office, like ivory tablets or decorated pouches. They would reside in more spacious and comfortably furnished apartments within the Forbidden City, receive significantly larger stipends and more luxurious rations, including an array of delicacies from the imperial kitchens, and they would command a retinue of lower-ranking eunuch attendants and servants. Most importantly, they would have privileged and often exclusive access to the emperor and other key members of the imperial family, and to the innermost sanctums and secrets of the palace. The exact number of eunuchs serving in the Forbidden City at its absolute zenith, particularly during certain reigns of the late Ming Dynasty, and the precise detailed breakdown of their numbers across all the dozens of specialized ranks. Departments, subdepartments, and myriad palace offices such as the infamous Ming Dynasty eunuch-led secret police agencies like the Eastern Depot or Western Depot, which wielded terrifying power, is exceptionally difficult for historians to determine with absolute, definitive accuracy. This is due to wide variations and sometimes deliberate obfuscations in surviving historical records, fluctuating recruitment and mortality rates over time, and the often opaque nature of palace accounting methods. What remains undeniably clear, however, is that it was a vast, deeply entrenched, and incredibly complex bureaucratic world, a unique society of men who were not men operating at the very heart of one of the world's greatest empires. This intricate internal hierarchy, this challenging and often perilous eunuch power ladder, was the fundamental framework within which the secret lives of these imperial servants unfolded day by day, year by year, reign by reign. For many, it was a life of unending anonymous drudgery at the bottom. For a persistent, skillful, and fortunate few, it was a path that, despite their profound initial sacrifice, could lead to a unique and often astonishing, if always precarious, form of comfort, security, and even world-shaping power. Having navigated the intricate ranks and departments of the eunuch establishment, from the lowest, most anonymous drudges to the powerful and influential directors who whispered in the emperor's ear, let's now try to imagine the daily rhythm of life for these unique imperial servants. What did a typical eunuch actually do all day within the vast, echoing, and meticulously ordered confines of the Forbidden City? While the specific tasks and responsibilities varied enormously depending on an individual eunuch's rank, his assigned department, and the particular imperial personage he served. The overarching theme of his existence was one of almost ceaseless, highly regimented, and often physically and emotionally exhausting service. Their lives were orchestrated around the imperial clockwork, the needs, the whims, the rituals, and the ceremonial duties of the Son of Heaven and his extensive, secluded household. It was a life lived in constant performance of deference, efficiency, and often a carefully cultivated, almost preternatural, unobtrusiveness. For the vast majority of eunuchs in the Forbidden City, and especially those in the lower and middle ranks, the day would begin long before the first faint rays of dawn even thought about gracing the golden-tiled roofs of the palace. In the pre-dawn chill, which could be particularly biting during the harsh Beijing winters, or in the thick, humid stillness of a summer night, the eunuchs responsible for the most basic yet essential services would already be stirring from their communal dormitories Jingxi. Their first crucial task would be to prepare the sprawling palace complex for the awakening of its imperial residents. This was no small feat. It meant quietly and efficiently lighting the hundreds, perhaps thousands of oil lamps and candles that would provide illumination in the vast, dim halls and intricate corridors before sunrise. It involved tending to the charcoal braziers that provided essential warmth in the cold winter months, ensuring they were burning safely and effectively without producing excessive smoke. And then there was the endless, Herculean task of cleaning. Imagine teams of eunuchs, armed with long bamboo brooms, meticulously sweeping the expansive stone-paved courtyards, ensuring not a stray leaf or speck of dust marred their imperial perfection. Others would be carefully dusting the ornate lacquered furniture, the intricate carved wooden screens, the priceless porcelain vases, and the gleaming bronze ritual vessels, using soft feather dusters or silk cloths. Every visible surface in the areas that might be frequented by the emperor, the empress, or high-ranking concubines had to be kept absolutely spotless. They would also be responsible for fetching fresh water for the morning ablutions of their masters and mistresses, perhaps from wells within the palace grounds, or from specially designated, covered cisterns where water was stored. And they would prepare the initial morning tea, a ritual of great importance, ensuring the water was heated to the precise, preferred temperature and that the correct type of rare tribute tea leaves were used, all according to the specific and often unyielding preferences of the imperial personage they served. The daily life of imperial eunuchs was incredibly, almost unimaginably, highly regimented, and it revolved almost entirely around the constant, meticulous service of the emperor, the empress, the numerous imperial concubines, and other members of the sprawling imperial clan. Their duties encompassed a truly vast range of tasks, from the most menial forms of physical labor and the most intimate acts of personal attendance, to highly complex administrative responsibilities, deeply involved ceremonial duties, and even critical internal security functions, often demanding their unwavering attention from well before the first light of dawn until very late into the night, with precious little personal respite or autonomy. It was a 24/7, 365 days a year operation, and they were its indispensable, if often entirely unacknowledged and deeply undervalued, workforce. Did you remember to align the Emperor's ceremonial jade toothpick precisely one rice grain width to the left of his third favorite nephrite spittoon? Little Willow Branch. A stern-faced supervising eunuch might interrogate a trembling novice. Last week it was a barleycorn width off, and the Imperial astrologer declared that it caused a minor but detectable imbalance in the cosmic flow of positive qi, directly resulting in a slightly overcooked Imperial breakfast egg. The Son of Heaven was displeased. We cannot have a repeat of the great overcooked egg incident of 1673. Dynasties have probably fallen for less. Heads will most definitely roll. Are we clear on the vital importance of toothpick alignment? Once the Emperor, the Empress, or other high-ranking imperial family members began their day, the duties of those eunuchs assigned as personal attendants would intensify considerably. This was often a position of considerable trust, but also of almost unbearable pressure and constant scrutiny. These eunuchs, often of a slightly higher rank and carefully chosen for their discretion, their intelligence, their refined manners, and sometimes even their pleasing if somewhat androgynous appearance, would assist their imperial masters or mistresses with the incredibly elaborate and time-consuming process of dressing and grooming. Imperial robes were not simple garments, they were complex, multi-layered affairs of the finest silk, often heavily embroidered with potent symbolic motifs like dragons for the emperor, phoenixes for the empress, auspicious clouds, and representations of the cosmos. Hairstyles, especially for the empress and the high-ranking concubines, could be incredibly intricate, involving wigs, elaborate hairpieces woven from human or animal hair, and a dazzling array of jeweled hairpins, combs, and ornaments made of gold, silver, jade, pearls, and kingfisher feathers. Eunuchs would be responsible for laying out these garments in the correct order, assisting with the complex process of dressing which might take hours, arranging the intricate hairstyles, though specialized female palace attendants, or gongnu, were often primarily responsible for the most intimate aspects of the imperial women's coiffure and makeup, and ensuring that every single detail of the imperial personage's appearance was absolutely perfect. Reflecting their supreme status and the solemnity of their office or rank, they would then serve the imperial meals. This was another highly ritualized and incredibly complex affair, often involving dozens, if not hundreds, of different dishes presented in a precise, unvarying order, using specific types of exquisite porcelain or even, for the emperor himself, gold and silver tableware. Eunuchs would transport the vast array of dishes from the distant imperial kitchens, which were a massive, sprawling complex in their own right, staffed by legions of cooks, assistant cooks, and still more eunuchs to the various imperial dining halls or private residential apartments, often using insulated carrying cases to try and keep the food warm during its long journey through the palace. They would then arrange the dishes before the emperor or empress with meticulous care and stand by silently, often kneeling, ready to serve tiny portions of selected dishes into the imperial bowl, to pour tea or wine, or to clear away dishes as soon as they were finished with. In some dynasties, and for particularly cautious or paranoid emperors who feared assassination attempts, trusted eunuchs might also be responsible for tasting each dish for poison before it was served to the Son of Heaven, a rather unenviable and potentially fatal occupational hazard. This peacock tongue stew tastes a little suspicious, Your Majesty. A food-tasting eunuch might nervously announce, "Perhaps you'd prefer the braised sea cucumber? I had a small nibble of that earlier, and I only feel a slight sense of impending doom, which is probably unrelated." Throughout the long imperial day, these personal attendant eunuchs would be constantly on call, expected to anticipate the every need and unspoken whim of their master or mistress. This could involve anything from fetching a particular book of poetry or a specific calligraphic scroll from the Imperial Library, preparing a certain type of rare tribute incense to perfume the Imperial chambers, arranging for musicians or opera performers, often other, specially trained eunuchs to provide entertainment, carrying confidential messages to other parts of the palace, accompanying the emperor on his carefully orchestrated walks in the magnificent imperial gardens, or simply standing by in absolute, silent, unobtrusive readiness for hours on end, waiting for the slightest nod, the faintest gesture, the almost imperceptible indication of an imperial need. They had to be masters of observation, able to read the most subtle expressions and interpret the most indirect commands, and to act with swift, silent, and flawless efficiency. For those many eunuchs who were employed in the numerous administrative roles within the palace, their day would be filled with what we might recognize as a form of intensive office work, though their offices were often grand. Chilly halls or smaller, cluttered studies within the sprawling palace complex, and their computers were reed brushes, inkstones, and an endless supply of paper or silk scrolls in later dynasties. Though earlier records were on more durable if less convenient materials, they would be managing the complex accounts for their respective departments. The all-powerful Imperial Household Department, the highly influential Directorate of Ceremonial, the Imperial Workshops, the Palace Granaries, the Imperial Treasuries, and so on, meticulously tracking vast sums of money, recording income from imperial estates or tribute, and itemizing expenditures on everything from food and silk to building materials and military supplies for the palace guards. They would be drafting and copying official documents, imperial edicts that would affect the lives of millions, memorials and petitions submitted by outer court officials, internal palace regulations, diplomatic correspondence, and letters to imperial relatives. They would be managing vast inventories of all the goods that flowed into and out of the palace, tribute silks from Suzhou, fine porcelain from Jingdezhen, rare medicinal herbs, precious jades, exotic furs, books for the imperial library, pigments for the palace artists. They might also be involved in personnel management for the thousands of other eunuchs and palace staff, dealing with duty rosters, assignments, promotions and demotions, disciplinary actions, and the distribution of stipends and rations. This was the boring but absolutely essential bureaucratic backbone that kept the entire imperial state, at least its palace-centered operations and the emperor's personal household, functioning with a semblance of order and efficiency. Many eunuchs were also deeply involved in the maintenance and operation of the palace on a larger, more physical scale. Some supervised the constant upkeep and repair of the hundreds of palace buildings, a never-ending task. Others managed the extensive imperial gardens, ensuring the peonies bloomed at precisely the right moment for the emperor's viewing pleasure, and that the imperial carp ponds were appropriately stocked with auspiciously colored fish. Others still ran the imperial stables, overseeing the care and training of the emperor's prized horses, which were vital for imperial processions, hunts, and as symbols of power. And, as we've noted, eunuch guards were responsible for the internal security of the Forbidden City, particularly the deeply restricted inner court, patrolling its labyrinthine corridors day and night and manning its countless gates and checkpoints. Ritual duties formed a significant and unceasing part of the imperial calendar, and eunuchs were absolutely central to their flawless performance. The emperor's daily life was heavily, almost overwhelmingly, ritualized, from his morning audiences and private devotions to the grand seasonal sacrifices he performed at the Temple of Heaven for good harvests or the altar of earth, and the innumerable festivals, ancestral rites, state banquets, and court ceremonies that structured the official life of the Son of Heaven. Eunuchs were responsible for every minute detail of these complex performances, preparing the sacred spaces, meticulously arranging the ritual implements' bronze vessels, jade tablets, silk banners, ensuring the correct offerings, sacrificial animals, special foods, wine, silk, incense were available and presented in the prescribed manner, and managing the intricate ceremonial robes worn by the emperor and other participants. They would guide the emperor and other key figures through the complex, often ancient, steps of each ritual, ensuring every gesture, every kowtow, and every spoken pronouncement was performed with absolute, unwavering correctness according to centuries of accumulated precedent. A single mistake in a major state ritual, a dropped offering, a misspoken incantation, could be interpreted as a disastrously ill omen for the dynasty and the empire, and the eunuchs in charge would undoubtedly face the direst of consequences. A quirky or fringe tidbit that highlights the incredibly pervasive and intimate nature of their service is that eunuchs were often responsible for keeping exceptionally detailed, almost minute-by-minute written records of the emperor's daily activities and even his physical state. These were sometimes known as the Diaries of Activity and Repose, Chiuju Chijuju, or similar titles. These diaries, compiled by specially assigned eunuch diarists, would meticulously note everything from whom the emperor met with and what state business he conducted, to precisely what he ate for each meal, what entertainment he enjoyed, what casual remarks he made, his moods, his sleep patterns, and sometimes even, in the most discreet of terms, details of his interactions with his empress and concubines, while ostensibly kept for the historical record to provide a model of imperial behavior for future generations or a cautionary tale. This constant, meticulous recording also served as a form of subtle surveillance and a way for those around the emperor, particularly powerful eunuchs, empresses or high officials, to track his habits, his preferences, and his vulnerabilities. The eunuch diarists were, in essence, the original imperial biographers, writing the first draft of history one careful brushstroke at a time, often from an incredibly, and sometimes uncomfortably, close perspective. Even the night offered little genuine respite for many of the eunuchs serving in the Forbidden City. They would work in carefully managed shifts, some standing guard in the silent, vast, and often eerie darkened corridors and courtyards, others maintaining the flickering lamps and candles that provided the only illumination in the absence of the sun, and many remaining instantly available to attend to any needs of the imperial family members who might awaken, require a drink of water, feel unwell, or summon them for any other reason, however trivial or urgent. The Forbidden City, for all its daytime grandeur and ceremonial bustle, never truly slept, and its thousands of eunuch staff were the ones who kept its nocturnal pulse beating, its secrets guarded, and its imperial inhabitants served around the clock. Day after weary day, the degree of personal autonomy or any kind of unstructured free time available to eunuchs of different ranks within this relentless schedule, and just how much their daily routines were dictated by absolutely rigid, unvarying protocol versus being subject to the personal preferences, moods, or sudden, unpredictable caprices of their imperial masters and mistresses, likely varied enormously and is a subject of ongoing historical inquiry into the actual lived, day-to-day experience of palace life for these unique individuals. For a very low-ranking eunuch assigned to the endless task of, say, polishing the imperial bronze mirrors until he could see his own exhausted reflection perfectly, the day was likely a soul-crushing monotony of servitude with virtually no personal freedom. For a very high-ranking, powerful, and personally favored eunuch who was the emperor's trusted confidant and de facto chief of staff, the day might be filled with high-stakes political discussions, immense responsibility, and perhaps even occasional moments of shared, if always unequal, companionship or intellectual stimulation. But for all of them, regardless of rank, their time, their energy, their very lives were, ultimately, not their own. They belonged entirely to the Son of Heaven and to the relentless, intricate, and ever-demanding imperial clockwork of the Forbidden City. You've now glimpsed the rigorous training, the often crushing daily routines, and the intricate hierarchies that define the existence of an imperial eunuch within the Forbidden City. Their lives were a constant ballet of service, protocol, and ambition, played out on the grandest of stages. But there was one area of the palace where their role was even more specialized, more sensitive, and more uniquely defined by their altered physical state: the inner court, the secluded residential sanctum of the emperor's empress, his numerous consorts and concubines, and the young imperial children. Here, eunuchs were not just servants. They were the exclusive male guardians, the ever-present attendants, and the often unseen arbiters of a world largely hidden from all other men. This was a position that demanded absolute trust, yet was perpetually fraught with trepidation. Let's gently part the silken curtains and explore the eunuch's unique and complex role as the guardians of the imperial harem. The inner court, or Hogong Hogong, Literally, the back palace was a world unto itself, a labyrinth of opulent residential compounds, private gardens, secluded temples, and connecting corridors, all designed to house and serve the emperor's female family members and ensure their utmost privacy and security. This was the domain of the Empress Huanghu, the highest-ranking woman in the empire. The various ranks of imperial consorts Guifei, Fei, Pin, etc., and a potentially vast number of concubines Guanu, all of whom were, in theory, dedicated to the service and pleasure of the Son of Heaven, and, crucially, to the production of imperial heirs. Young princes and unmarried princesses also resided here under the care of their mothers and eunuch attendants. The atmosphere would have been one of luxurious confinement, a gilded cage where beauty, ritual, and often intense boredom and fierce personal rivalries coexisted. Think of it as the most exclusive, high-stakes, and internally competitive sorority in the entire empire, where the ultimate prize was the emperor's fleeting attention, and the consequences of losing favor could be devastating. The Wi-Fi password for the inner court, had such a thing existed, would undoubtedly have been something incredibly ornate, changed hourly by the head eunuch of internal communications, and probably involved at least 3 different types of mythological creatures. The most fundamental reason for the eunuch's exclusive role as the adult male presence within these private quarters was, as we've touched upon, the absolute dynastic imperative of ensuring the legitimacy of the imperial bloodline. There could be no whisper of doubt about the paternity of any child born within these walls who might one day ascend the dragon throne. Eunuchs, having undergone complete castration, were deemed incapable of fathering children and thus posed no sexual threat to the imperial women. This made them the only safe category of adult males allowed to move freely within and manage the daily affairs of the harem. Imperial Chinese eunuchs were uniquely positioned as the primary male servants and guardians within the inner court. The residential palaces of the emperor, the empress, and the multitudinous imperial concubines, a role justified by the overriding dynastic need to ensure the purity of the imperial bloodline and to uphold strict Confucian norms regarding female seclusion and chastity. This wasn't just a practical arrangement, it was a deeply symbolic one, reinforcing the emperor's unique patriarchal authority and the sanctity of his lineage. In their role as guardians, eunuchs controlled all access to the women's quarters. They manned the gates leading into these secluded areas, carefully vetting anyone who sought entry. Even high-ranking officials or imperial relatives from the outer court would require explicit permission and would often be escorted by eunuchs. They patrolled the corridors, maintained a watchful presence, and were responsible for the internal security of this very private, very sensitive domain. They were, in effect, the first line of defense against any unauthorized intrusion. Any breach of protocol, or any hint of scandal that could tarnish the reputation of the imperial family. Their duties also involved the most intimate and personal service to the empress and the concubines. Eunuchs would assist with their daily routines, helping them to dress in their elaborate silk robes and intricate jewelry, serving their meals in their private apartments, running errands for them within the palace, arranging their leisure activities, perhaps a game of Go, a musical performance by other eunuchs, or a stroll in a secluded garden. They would attend to their comfort, ensuring their chambers were properly heated or cooled as much as 17th century technology allowed. Remember our previous discussions on evaporative cooling. Their favorite incense was burning, or their preferred tea was brewed to perfection. For the imperial women, many of whom lived lives of considerable isolation from the outside world and even from much of the rest of the palace, their personal eunuch attendants were often their most constant human companions, their primary link to the day-to-day functioning of the vast imperial household. This constant proximity could, and often did, lead to the formation of close, sometimes deeply complex relationships. A favored eunuch might become a trusted confidant to an empress or a high-ranking consort. He would be privy to her personal thoughts, her hopes, her fears, her frustrations, and, crucially, her strategies in the often intense rivalries and power struggles that characterized life in the harem. These women vied for the emperor's favor, for the prestige of bearing him a son, especially the heir apparent, and for their own status and security within the court. A loyal and intelligent eunuch could be an invaluable ally in these endeavors, offering advice, carrying secret messages, gathering information about rivals, or subtly promoting his mistress's interest to other influential eunuchs or even to the emperor himself. This position of trust could be a significant source of informal power for the eunuch. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some particularly high-ranking and capable eunuchs who served powerful empresses, empress dowagers, or favored concubines essentially became the de facto chiefs of staff or general managers of these women's extensive personal households within the palace. They would control their mistress's considerable finances allowances, gifts, income from any personal estates, manage her large retinue of attendant junior eunuchs and palace maids, oversee the upkeep and decoration of her private palaces and gardens, procure luxury goods for her silks, jades, perfumes, exotic foods, and even act as her primary agent and representative in courtly politics, wielding considerable delegated authority in her name. Such a eunuch was far more than a servant. He was a major player in the inner court power structure. However, this proximity to intimacy and power was perpetually fraught with trepidation and acute danger. The inner court was a hothouse of intrigue. A eunuch who became too closely identified with one imperial woman or one faction could find himself in mortal peril if his mistress fell from favor, or if a rival faction gained ascendancy. The risk of being caught in the crossfire of these harem rivalries was constant. A careless word, a perceived slight, a misinterpreted gesture, or even a false accusation of impropriety, however physically unlikely. Accusations of disloyalty or theft were always possible, could lead to swift and brutal punishment, demotion to the most demeaning tasks, a painful flogging, exile to a remote and unhealthy part of the palace, or even a quiet, unrecorded execution. The eunuchs serving in the inner court were truly walking a razor's edge every single day. Their survival depended on their absolute discretion, their ability to read the subtlest shifts in mood and political currents, and their skill in navigating a world where favor was fleeting and enmities could be deadly. The pressure to remain loyal, or at least to appear loyal, to their immediate mistress, while also not offending other powerful figures, including rival concubines or more senior eunuchs, must have been immense. It was a masterclass in high-stakes diplomacy and mind-reading. Performed daily? Eunuch Wei, a nervous junior attendant might whisper to a colleague. Did you see the look Consort Lin gave Consort Mei when the Emperor complimented Consort Mei's new hairpin? I'm going to spend the rest of the day pretending to be a particularly uninteresting potted plant. It's safer. Eunuchs also served as crucial intermediaries between the deeply secluded inner court, which was primarily the domain of women and the emperor's private life, and the male-dominated outer court, where the official business of state was conducted by scholar officials. Messages, requests, and even subtle policy suggestions might pass from an influential empress or a favored concubine through her trusted eunuchs to the emperor himself, or sometimes, discreetly, to sympathetic or allied officials in the outer court. Conversely, information, petitions, or warnings from the outer court might sometimes reach the emperor or influential women of the inner court more quickly or effectively through a trusted eunuch than through the often slow and cumbersome official bureaucratic channels. This intermediary role placed eunuchs at a unique and powerful nexus of information and influence, but it also exposed them to deep suspicion and often outright hostility from the scholar officials, who generally viewed any eunuch involvement in state affairs as corrupting and illegitimate. The extent to which eunuchs genuinely protected the actual interests and personal well-being of the imperial women they served, versus primarily serving as instruments of imperial control and surveillance, reporting back to the emperor or senior eunuchs on the women's activities and moods, or ruthlessly pursuing their own personal ambitions or their faction's agendas within the complex and often cutthroat harem system, is a profoundly complex issue that historians of the imperial Chinese court continue to debate, often dependent on the specific historical period, the individual personalities involved, and the biases of the surviving source materials. Some eunuchs undoubtedly formed bonds of genuine loyalty and affection with the women they served for decades, offering sincere companionship and support in their often lonely and constrained lives. Others were likely opportunistic, cruel, or deeply enmeshed in the power struggles, using their proximity to the imperial women for their own gain. Most, perhaps, fell somewhere in between, navigating a difficult path with a mixture of duty, self-preservation, and varying degrees of compassion. Ultimately, the role of eunuchs as the guardians and servants of the inner sanctum was a defining and deeply paradoxical feature of the imperial Chinese system for millennia. It was a role born of a perceived dynastic necessity, the protection of imperial lineage and Confucian propriety, but it created a unique class of individuals who, despite their profound physical alteration and their often humble origins, found themselves at the very heart of imperial power, privy to its most intimate secrets, wielding unique forms of influence, and constantly subject to its most extreme pressures and its most enticing, if perilous, rewards. Their lives within those secluded chambers were a constant, silent, watchful dance of service, observation, carefully cultivated trust, and ever-present trepidation. We've now seen the imperial eunuchs as the ubiquitous, essential, and often unseen workforce of the Forbidden City. Their lives dedicated to the meticulous daily routines of the palace and the intimate, sensitive service of the inner court. While the vast majority of these thousands of individuals toiled in relative obscurity, performing their duties with diligence and discretion, simply to survive and perhaps achieve a modest level of comfort. The unique structure of the imperial system, particularly the eunuch's unparalleled proximity to the Son of Heaven, created a recurring phenomenon throughout Chinese history, the rise of power eunuchs. These were individuals who, through a combination of intelligence, ambition, political acumen, and often the emperor's personal favor, managed to transcend their role as mere servants and accumulate immense political influence, sometimes to the point where they could effectively rival or even overshadow the highest-ranking scholar officials of the outer court. Let's gently explore how these whispers to power, emanating from the supposedly servile figures of the inner court, could come to shape the policies, appointments, and even the fate of the entire Chinese empire. The most fundamental pathway to power for a eunuch was, quite simply, intimate and prolonged proximity to the emperor. Throughout Chinese imperial history, particularly during dynasties like the Eastern Han, 25 or 1002 or 20 CE, the Tang 618, 907 CE, and most notoriously the Ming 1368, 1644, certain imperial eunuchs rose to positions of extraordinary, almost unprecedented political power. They often achieved this by serving as close personal advisors and confidants to emperors, thereby controlling access to the Son of Heaven, heading powerful and often feared palace agencies, and directly influencing critical state policies and high-level official appointments. A eunuch who had been a childhood playmate and companion to a young prince who later ascended the dragon throne, or one who served as the emperor's trusted personal attendant for many years. Sharing his most private moments, his anxieties, and his daily routines could develop a bond of deep intimacy and unwavering reliance that no outside official, however brilliant or loyal, could ever hope to match. They were there when the emperor woke in the morning, when he ate his meals, when he relaxed in his private gardens, when he was ill or feeling vulnerable, and often when he was making crucial decisions of state. In these unguarded moments, outside the formal, ritualized constraints of the audience hall, a clever, articulate, and ambitious eunuch could offer seemingly disinterested counsel, plant subtle ideas, gently promote his allies and patrons, or discreetly undermine his rivals and their policies. He had the emperor's ear at times when the meticulously crafted memorials and petitions from the grand secretaries and ministers of the outer court might be gathering dust in an antechamber, perhaps never even reaching the imperial gaze if a powerful eunuch decided otherwise. "Your Majesty," a trusted senior eunuch might whisper while carefully refilling the imperial wine cup or arranging the cushions on the imperial couch. That rather lengthy proposal from the Ministry of Rites concerning the precise shade of yellow to be used for the third-rank concubine's spring festival robes. Perhaps it requires a more leisurely period of celestial contemplation. I also happen to overhear some rather interesting chatter in the palace corridors about Minister Cheng's surprising new collection of suspiciously acquired antique bronze vessels. Just a fleeting thought, of course, for your divine wisdom to consider. Naturally, This ability to control the flow of information to and from the emperor was one of the most potent and consistently wielded tools of powerful eunuchs. They often managed the imperial seals, which were necessary to validate official documents. They might be tasked with reading and summarizing the voluminous official documents and memorials submitted by the bureaucracy for the emperor, especially if the emperor was disinclined to wade through tedious administrative prose himself, a not uncommon imperial affliction. In doing so, they could subtly filter, prioritize, or even suppress information. They also often decided which officials or which petitions would be granted the precious opportunity of an imperial audience. By controlling this vital access, they could effectively shape the emperor's perception of reality, promote policies and individuals they favored, and block or delay those they opposed. They became the ultimate gatekeepers, the indispensable and often deeply resented intermediaries between the secluded Son of Heaven and the vast, complex machinery of the state. The influence of eunuchs could become particularly pronounced and often problematic from the perspective of traditional Confucian governance. If an emperor was very young when he ascended the throne, or if he proved to be indecisive, easily swayed by personal favorites, or simply more interested in his pleasures and hobbies than in the tedious day-to-day business of ruling the empire. In such cases, a powerful eunuch, or a tightly knit clique of eunuchs, could easily step into the resulting power vacuum, effectively running the administration in the emperor's name, or at least heavily influencing his decisions. They might issue edicts ostensibly with imperial approval, make key appointments to high government posts often favoring their own protégés or those who had paid them hefty bribes, control the state treasury, and dispense justice or injustice, all while maintaining the crucial fiction that they were merely the loyal and selfless servants carrying out the imperial will. This was a recurring pattern in many dynasties, often leading to periods of intense corruption, bitter factional strife between eunuchs and scholar officials, and ultimately contributing to dynastic weakness and decline. Some dynasties, most notoriously the Ming, went so far as to institutionalize and even expand eunuch power by creating powerful, eunuch-led government agencies that operated outside, and often above, the regular bureaucratic channels. The most infamous of these were the Eastern Depot Dongcheng, established by the Yongle Emperor, and later its even more feared offshoots, the Western Depot Shichong and the Inner Branch Depot Neihangcheng. These were essentially secret police and intelligence organizations, run entirely by eunuchs, with sweeping and often unchecked powers to investigate, arrest, interrogate frequently using brutal torture to extract confessions, and summarily punish anyone, including the highest-ranking scholar officials and military commanders who were suspected of treason, corruption, plotting against the throne, or even just criticizing powerful eunuch figures. While ostensibly created to protect the emperor from internal enemies and ensure the security of the state, these eunuch-led secret services often became instruments of terror and political persecution, used by dominant eunuch factions to eliminate their rivals, silence dissent, and amass even greater personal power and wealth. The very names of these depots struck fear into the hearts of the officialdom and the populace alike. Having your case referred to the Eastern Depot for further investigation was generally not good news for your long-term career prospects, or indeed your continued existence. Powerful eunuchs would also dedicate considerable effort to building extensive factions and patronage networks, both within the eunuch establishment itself, often based on those adoptive father-son relationships we've previously discussed, or on shared regional origins, and by cultivating strategic alliances with certain sympathetic or opportunistic officials in the outer court, or with influential members of the imperial clan or powerful empress dowagers and consort families. These intricate networks allowed them to consolidate their influence across different branches of the palace and government, promote their protégés to key positions, protect their collective interests, and effectively wage political warfare against their adversaries. Palace politics became a complex, shadowy, and often deadly game of shifting alliances, betrayals, and bitter rivalries, with powerful eunuch factions frequently playing a central, if officially denigrated and historically condemned, role. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some particularly powerful and successful eunuchs, having amassed huge personal fortunes, sometimes engaged in surprisingly legitimate by the often flexible standards of the palace business ventures or investments outside their official duties. They might control imperial monopolies on certain valuable commodities like rare teas, special silks, or specific minerals in some periods, manage vast imperial agricultural estates or specialized workshops that produced high-quality goods for trade both domestic and sometimes even foreign, through intermediaries, or even act as informal imperial bankers, lending out state funds or their own accumulated wealth at interest. They could become incredibly wealthy entrepreneurs in their own right, their economic power further bolstering their political influence. Of course, the line between legitimate imperial enterprise managed by eunuchs and outright corruption or exploitation of state resources for personal gain was often exceedingly thin and frequently crossed. The constant simmering and often explosive tension between these powerful eunuch factions and the traditional Confucian scholar officials who staffed the regular government bureaucracy is one of the most persistent and defining themes throughout much of Chinese imperial history. The scholar officials, steeped in centuries of Confucian ideals about meritocracy rule by the educated and virtuous, proper hierarchical governance by morally upright scholar gentlemen, and a deep-seated suspicion of any inner court, palace-based interference in the affairs of the outer court, the formal state administration generally despised eunuchs with a passion. They viewed eunuchs as fundamentally uneducated, often an unfair generalization, as many high-ranking eunuchs were highly literate, skilled administrators, and even accomplished scholars or artists in their own right, inherently greedy and sycophantic due to their social origins and physical state, and a profoundly corrupting and illegitimate influence on the emperor and the proper functioning of the state. Eunuchs, in turn, often resented the arrogance, perceived hypocrisy, and frequent obstructionism of the scholar officials, and fought fiercely and often ruthlessly to protect their own hard-won positions and influence. This ongoing power struggle between the inner court, often seen as dominated by eunuchs and imperial relatives, and the outer court, the domain of the scholar officials, was a defining feature of many dynasties, and the shifting balance of power between these two groups often determined the political stability, administrative effectiveness, and even the ultimate longevity of the ruling house. Historians continue to debate vigorously whether the recurring phenomenon of powerful and often deeply corrupt eunuch factions in Chinese imperial history was primarily a result of inherent structural flaws in the autocratic imperial system itself. A system that inadvertently allowed for or even encouraged such intimate, extra-legal influence perhaps as emperors deliberately sought to use loyal eunuchs as a personal power base and a counterweight to the potentially overweening power of the entrenched scholar official bureaucracy, or if it was more a product of specific historical circumstances, such as the reigns of particularly weak, negligent, or easily manipulated emperors, the exceptional personal ambitions and political abilities of certain extraordinary individual eunuchs who managed to seize opportunities, or the intensity of their existential power struggles with the ever-hostile scholar official class. It was most likely a complex interplay of all these factors, creating a unique, recurring, and often deeply problematic dynamic at the very heart of Chinese imperial power for over 2 millennia. For those very few eunuchs who managed to reach these dizzying heights of influence, the whispers they directed into the imperial ear could indeed shape the destiny of millions, a truly extraordinary and often perilous trajectory for individuals who had begun their palace careers with such a profound and painful personal sacrifice. We've witnessed how some imperial eunuchs, through their unique access and often astute political maneuvering, could ascend from the depths of servitude to become formidable whispers to power, wielding influence that could shape the course of the Chinese Empire. But with such proximity to the imperial treasury, such control over palace resources, and such influence over appointments and policies, came not just political power, but also immense opportunities for personal enrichment. While a great many eunuchs undoubtedly lived out their lives in modest, diligent, and perhaps even impoverished service, the historical record is also replete with accounts of eunuchs who amassed staggering fortunes, lived in breathtaking luxury, and became bywords for corruption and avarice. Let's gently lift the silken money bags and peek into this darker side of eunuch power, exploring the silk purses they managed to fill and the often deep moral compromises that came with such fortunes within the Forbidden City. It's crucial to remember that for the vast majority of the tens of thousands of eunuchs who might be serving in the Forbidden City at any given time, especially those in the lower echelons, life was one of unremitting hard labor and relative poverty. Their official stipends, if they received them consistently, were often meager, barely enough for basic necessities beyond the often inadequate food and crowded lodging provided by the palace system. However, for those eunuchs who managed to successfully climb the slippery, treacherous rungs of the eunuch hierarchy, particularly those who gained positions of significant trust with the imperial family, or who came to control key palace departments and their budgets, the avenues for acquiring substantial wealth could be numerous, if often ethically questionable by any standard other than the often pragmatic and self-serving internal logic of the palace. Despite their origins frequently being in conditions of extreme poverty and the considerable social stigma attached to their altered physical status by mainstream Confucian society, some imperial Chinese eunuchs who rose to high positions within the palace bureaucracy or as intimate confidants to the emperor managed to accumulate enormous personal wealth and wielded significant, if often illicit, economic power. This was frequently achieved through their control of palace finances, their oversight of lucrative imperial state enterprises, and the systematic acceptance of substantial bribes, leading to frequent and often entirely justified accusations of widespread corruption from the ever-watchful and often resentful Confucian scholar officials of the outer court. What were the primary sources of this often immense wealth for the eunuch elite? Official salaries and allowances for high-ranking eunuchs could certainly be substantial, particularly for those at the very top of the eunuch administration, like the directors of the 12 great eunuch directorates in the Ming dynasty. However, these official emoluments, while comfortable, were often dwarfed by the potential for unofficial illicit gains. Gifts, a polite and often transparent euphemism for bribes, were almost certainly a major, if not the primary, source of income for many powerful eunuchs. Officials from the outer court seeking a crucial audience with the emperor, hoping for a favorable imperial decision on a memorial they had submitted, aiming for a lucrative provincial appointment or a prestigious promotion, or perhaps just wanting a potentially troublesome investigation by a eunuch-led agency to be quietly dropped, would often find it not just advisable but absolutely necessary to present gifts to the influential eunuchs who controlled access, information, and imperial favor. These gifts could range from chests overflowing with silver or gold ingots to bolts of the finest tribute silk, precious jade carvings, rare artworks and antiques, valuable books, or even deeds to land and property. A well-placed and sufficiently powerful eunuch could effectively act as a very expensive and entirely unofficial toll booth on the road to imperial attention and career advancement. "Ah, Your Excellency, Minister Fang," a powerful eunuch with a knowing smile might say, while admiring a newly presented, exquisitely carved ivory backscratcher, "your thoughtful token of esteem is most appreciated. I shall see if a brief window might perhaps open in His Celestial Majesty's incredibly demanding schedule to peruse your utterly fascinating 17-volume report on the optimal methods for counting individual rice grains in the imperial granaries. Perhaps next week, or the week after. These vital matters of state, you understand, require the most careful and unhurried consideration." Embezzlement from imperial coffers or the often vast and complex budgets of the various palace departments that eunuchs controlled was another all-too-common avenue for self-enrichment. A eunuch in charge of the imperial household department, for example, was responsible for managing literally astronomical sums of money intended for the upkeep of the sprawling palace complex. The salaries and provisions for thousands of staff members, including other eunuchs and palace maids, and the almost unbelievably lavish expenses of the entire imperial family. From their daily meals to their ceremonial robes and an endless stream of luxury goods. Skimming a percentage here, systematically inflating costs for supplies there, creating ghost employees on the payroll, or diverting state funds to personal projects or investments, could lead to the accumulation of enormous illicit fortunes. Control over imperial monopolies or lucrative state-run enterprises could also be incredibly profitable. In some dynasties, eunuchs were appointed to oversee and manage state monopolies on essential and highly profitable commodities, like salt, a vital preservative and seasoning, iron for tools and weapons, or tea. They might also manage vast imperial agricultural estates that produced surplus goods for sale, or direct the operations of imperial workshops producing high-value items like fine silk textiles, exquisite porcelain, or intricate lacquerware, which could then be sold for significant profit, some of which might conveniently find its way into their own personal treasuries. They might also control aspects of lucrative foreign trade passing through designated ports, or the collection and redistribution of valuable tribute goods from vassal states. Commissions, kickbacks, or outright sale of official offices were another well-worn path to riches, particularly during periods of weak imperial oversight or high eunuch dominance. If you desperately wanted that lucrative post as governor of a wealthy southern province, or a promotion to a higher rank in the bureaucracy, a significant donation or service fee paid to the influential eunuch who held sway over imperial appointments might be considered a wise, if morally compromising, career investment. The management of imperial estates, properties, or confiscated lands scattered throughout the empire could also provide numerous opportunities for personal enrichment. Through manipulating rents, selling off timber or other resources, or engaging in other forms of creative and often exploitative accounting. The display of wealth by some of these powerful and successful eunuchs could be truly astonishing, sometimes rivaling or even surpassing that of the highest hereditary nobility or imperial princes. They might live in opulent, multi-courtyard mansions if they were permitted by a particularly indulgent emperor to own property outside the immediate confines of the Forbidden City, or within designated high-status eunuch residential quarters inside the palace walls. Their private residences would be filled with the finest silks, exquisitely carved rosewood furniture, priceless collections of rare antiques, valuable paintings and calligraphic scrolls by famous masters, and glittering arrays of precious jade, gold, and silver objects. They might maintain large private retinues of their own servants, adopted eunuch sons who served as their heirs, lieutenants, and personal attendants, and even private troops of musicians or opera performers for their entertainment. They could host lavish banquets for their allies and clients, conspicuously patronize Buddhist or Taoist temples perhaps as a way to gain spiritual merit or launder their often ill-gotten reputations, and generally live a life of extreme, almost ostentatious, material luxury, all within the gilded, yet always precarious, cage of the imperial palace system. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some exceptionally wealthy and powerful eunuchs became significant, if sometimes controversial. Patrons of the arts and culture, they might commission beautiful paintings from court artists, collect rare books and manuscripts for their private libraries, sponsor exquisite calligraphy, or fund the construction and renovation of elaborate Buddhist or Taoist temples and monasteries. While this patronage could sometimes be seen as a genuine appreciation for art and learning, or an act of sincere piety, it was also often viewed by their detractors, particularly the Confucian scholar officials, as a cynical attempt to display their ill-gotten wealth, gain a veneer of cultural sophistication, or buy spiritual insurance against the karmic consequences of their often ruthless and corrupt worldly dealings. It was a way of saying, yes, I may have acquired my fortune through means that would make the ancient sages weep into their bamboo scrolls, but behold this magnificent new temple I have endowed. Surely that demonstrates my profound inner virtue and my excellent taste in gilded roof tiles. This large-scale accumulation of wealth and the often blatant political power wielded by certain eunuchs was, as we've noted, a constant and profound source of outrage and bitter resentment for the Confucian scholar officials who staffed the regular government bureaucracy. From a strict Confucian perspective, which emphasized rule by educated, morally upright scholar gentlemen who had proven their merit through the rigorous civil service examination system, eunuchs were seen as inherently incomplete men, often from uneducated and impoverished backgrounds. Morally suspect due to their physical alteration, which cut them off from the sacred duty of continuing the ancestral line, and fundamentally unsuited for positions of high authority or influence in the serious affairs of state. Their proper role in the eyes of these officials was one of menial, unobtrusive servitude within the private confines of the palace. The sight of eunuchs amassing vast fortunes, controlling access to the emperor, dictating policy, persecuting officials, and often behaving with an arrogance and impunity that seemed to mock Confucian ideals of propriety and good governance, was deeply offensive and seen as a sure sign of dynastic weakness and moral decay. This led to centuries of intense, often brutal political struggle between powerful eunuch factions and the scholar official class, with each side accusing the other of corruption, treason, and misleading the emperor for their own selfish ends. The eunuch problem, and the corruption associated with it, was a recurring and much lamented theme in traditional Chinese historiography, often cited as a major contributing factor to the decline and fall of several dynasties, most notably the Han, the Tang, and particularly the Ming. Of course, it is crucial to remember that not all eunuchs were corrupt, and certainly not all who achieved positions of some influence abused their power. Many were undoubtedly loyal, diligent, and capable administrators who served their emperors and the imperial household well, often under incredibly difficult and demanding circumstances. But the system itself, with its concentration of often unsupervised and unaccountable power in the hands of individuals who were, by their very nature, socially isolated from conventional family and societal constraints, yet intimately and continuously close to the ultimate source of all authority and wealth, the emperor, and it created enormous, almost irresistible temptations and unparalleled opportunities for corruption. The moral compromises required to simply survive, let alone thrive and accumulate wealth, in such a fiercely competitive, intrigue-laden, and often morally ambiguous environment could be immense. To gain and maintain power and fortune, a eunuch often had to engage in the very practices of bribery, factionalism, ruthless self-preservation, and carefully cultivated sycophancy that they might publicly, at least decry in others. It was a perilous and often deeply compromised game, where the glittering rewards could be fabulous silk purses, but the penalties for miscalculation or losing imperial favor could be swift, brutal, and utterly final. Whether the notorious and often systemic corruption associated with certain powerful eunuch factions throughout the long sweep of Chinese imperial history was an inevitable structural outcome of their unique and often extra-legal position within the autocratic imperial system, or if it was more a product of specific historical circumstances, such as the reigns of particularly weak, negligent, or easily manipulated emperors. The extraordinary personal avarice and moral failings of certain individual eunuchs, or the intensity and bitterness of their ongoing power struggles with the ever-hostile scholar-official bureaucracy, is a complex and multifaceted question that continues to be analyzed and debated by historians of imperial China. It was likely a toxic brew of all these elements, creating a recurring pattern of eunuch wealth, power, corruption, and eventual, often violent, backlash for a eunuch with a keen nose for opportunity and a flexible conscience. The Forbidden City, despite its name, could be a place where fortunes were indeed made, even if those fortunes were built upon foundations of moral compromise and silk-lined shadows. We've explored the pathways to power for imperial eunuchs, the ways some could accumulate vast fortunes, and the often intense antagonism between these inner court figures and the Confucian scholar officials of the outer court. But it would be a mistake to imagine the eunuch establishment itself as a monolithic, unified block, always acting with a single purpose. Far from it. The reality, within the crimson walls of the Forbidden City, was that the eunuch community, numbering in the thousands and organized into its own complex hierarchies, was often a seething cauldron of its own internal power struggles, intricate factions, bitter feuds, and carefully cultivated loyalties. The secret lives of eunuchs were not just about their service to the emperor or their interactions with the outside world. They were also profoundly shaped by the treacherous, whispered politics of their own unique, closed society. Let's now gently part the silken curtains a little further and witness the subtle, sometimes dangerous, and always fascinating dance of eunuch factions vying for dominance within the palace. Imagine the Forbidden City not just as the emperor's grand residence, but as a vast, self-contained ecosystem, with its own intricate food webs, its own predators and prey, its own territories to be defended, and its own complex symbiotic and sometimes parasitic relationships. Within this tightly controlled environment, the eunuchs, despite their shared physical alteration and their common role as imperial servants, formed a distinct and often highly competitive subsociety. The eunuch establishment in the Chinese imperial court was frequently characterized by intense internal rivalries and the formation of powerful, often long-lasting factions. These factions competed fiercely for influence over the emperor, for control of lucrative palace resources and key administrative positions within the eunuch bureaucracy itself, and quite often, for simple dominance and the ability to undermine or eliminate rival eunuch groups. This wasn't just about who got the slightly better quality rice in their daily rations, though that probably mattered too. This was serious, often high stakes, political maneuvering, with careers, fortunes, and sometimes even lives hanging in the balance. The gossip at the eunuch water cooler, or perhaps the eunuch communal tea station, wasn't just about the latest imperial whim, it was also about who was aligning with whom, who was on the rise, and whose star was about to spectacularly, and perhaps painfully, fall. Did you hear one junior eunuch might whisper to another over a bowl of thin congee in their crowded dormitory? Old Man Wang from the Directorate of Imperial Gardens has apparently thrown in his lot with Grand Eunuch Chen's faction. That means the Chrysanthemum Alliance is definitely making a move against the Peony Cabal in the Department of Ceremonial Auspices. Best keep our heads down and our brooms extra busy this week. The fallout could be messy. How did these eunuch factions typically form? Several key factors contributed to their development and cohesion. The adoptive family system, which we've touched upon, was a primary building block. Senior established eunuchs would adopt promising or loyal younger eunuchs as their sons or disciples. These eunuch fathers would then mentor, protect, and actively promote the careers of their sons within the palace bureaucracy. In return, these adopted sons owed their eunuch father, and by extension, his entire adoptive lineage or faction, absolute loyalty, obedience, and unwavering support in any internal power struggles. Over time, these artificial kinship networks could grow into extensive and powerful blocks, with grandfathers, uncles, and brothers, all bound by ties of mutual obligation and shared ambition. These eunuch clans could be incredibly resilient and deeply influential. Factions might also coalesce around particularly powerful, charismatic, or ruthless individual eunuchs who had managed to achieve high rank and gain the emperor's special favor or control over a key palace department. These dominant figures would attract a following of ambitious or dependent younger eunuchs who hoped to rise in their wake, or who simply sought the protection that came from aligning with a major power player. Loyalty to such a figure could bring significant rewards if he was in ascendance, but also grave danger if he eventually fell from imperial grace or was outmaneuvered by his rivals. Sometimes, factions might even form, at least initially, along regional lines, with eunuchs who hailed from the same province or district in the vast Chinese empire banding together for mutual support, companionship, and advancement in the often bewildering and fiercely competitive environment of the imperial capital and the Forbidden City. Shared dialect, local customs, or pre-existing family connections from their home regions could provide a basis for trust and solidarity. Crucially, eunuch factions often align themselves with different powerful figures or factions within the imperial family itself. They might attach themselves to a particular empress, a favored high-ranking consort, an influential empress dowager, or even one of the imperial princes who was seen as a likely successor to the throne. By backing the right imperial personage, a eunuch faction could hope to reap immense rewards, promotions, lucrative appointments, increased influence, if their chosen patron gained ultimate power or became the new emperor. This, of course, made eunuchs key, if often shadowy players in the frequently deadly succession struggles and harem intrigues that plagued many imperial reigns. What were these eunuch factions competing for? The primary prize always was access to and influence over the emperor. The closer a eunuch or a eunuch faction was to the Son of Heaven, the more power they could wield, both formally and informally. They competed fiercely for the most lucrative and strategically important assignments within the sprawling palace bureaucracy. The directorship of the Imperial Household Department, which controlled the palace's vast finances and resources, the headship of the Directorate of Ceremonial, which often controlled the flow of documents to and from the emperor, command of certain specialized palace guard units, a direct source of coercive physical power, or key positions within the emperor's private secretariat or his personal living quarters. They also vied for control over vital palace resources, the distribution of luxury goods like silks and jades, the management of the imperial workshops that produced these goods, the allocation of palace budgets, and the awarding of profitable contracts. And, of course, they competed for dominance over other eunuch factions, constantly seeking to place their own members in key positions of power and to undermine, marginalize, or even completely oust their eunuch rivals. The methods of intrigue employed in these internal power struggles could be as complex, as subtle, and as ruthless as any court politics found in the outer court among the scholar officials, if not more so, given the close quarters, the constant surveillance, and the often desperate stakes involved for individuals who had already sacrificed so much to be there. Spreading malicious rumors and carefully crafted slander against rival eunuchs or entire opposing factions was a common tactic. Since reputation and the emperor's perception were paramount, a well-placed, damaging rumor, perhaps questioning a rival's loyalty, competence, or even their financial probity, could destroy a career or cripple an entire faction. Spying and covertly reporting on each other's activities, private conversations, and perceived loyalties was a constant feature of life within the eunuch establishment. Eunuchs, by the very nature of their service, were often masters of quiet observation, subtle insinuation, and the gathering of secrets, forming secret alliances in which were often shifting, pragmatic, and temporary, was essential for survival and advancement in this treacherous environment. They might also try to use their influence with powerful members of the imperial family, an empress who favored their faction, a concubine who owed them a debt of gratitude, or a young prince whose career they were carefully nurturing, to subtly undermine their eunuch opponents in the eyes of the emperor. In extreme cases, particularly during periods of very weak imperial rule or exceptionally intense factional strife such as occurred at various points during the late Ming dynasty, these internal eunuch power struggles could escalate to more direct and dangerous actions. This might involve elaborately framing rivals for serious crimes they didn't commit, leading to their demotion, exile to a remote and unhealthy part of the empire, or even a quiet, unrecorded execution within the palace walls. While outright physical assassination within the eunuch ranks was likely rare and incredibly risky as it could destabilize the entire palace if discovered, the political assassination of rivals through carefully orchestrated legal means or by systematically poisoning the emperor's mind against them was certainly a known and feared tactic. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some particularly powerful and well-organized eunuch factions developed their own secret codes, clandestine meeting places within the sprawling labyrinth of the Forbidden City, or even subtle identifying symbols, gestures, or passwords to coordinate their activities, protect their secrets from rival groups, and distinguish their members from those of other, potentially hostile factions. It was a shadowy world of whispered conspiracies, hidden allegiances, and carefully guarded information, all played out in the silken, perfumed corridors of power. The Jade Scepter Society convenes by the moss-covered rockery in the Garden of Forgotten Concubines at the hour of the rat. A nervous eunuch might whisper to a trusted confederate. The password is, "The Emperor's new fighting cricket has a slight cough." Light. Bring the latest intelligence reports on the Order of the Gilded Carp's unfortunate investments in Inner Mongolian sheep futures. And for goodness sake, try not to look like you're plotting. We're just appreciating the moonlight. The Emperor's role in all this intricate eunuch factionalism was, of course, crucial. A strong, decisive, and politically astute emperor might skillfully keep eunuch factions in check, perhaps by deliberately playing different groups off against each other, or by clearly favoring one particularly loyal and competent group while firmly suppressing others, all as a way to maintain his own ultimate authority and prevent any single eunuch or faction from becoming too powerful, a classic divide and rule strategy. However, a weak, indecisive, easily manipulated, or simply disinterested emperor could easily become a pawn in these internal eunuch power struggles, with disastrous consequences for the stability of his court, the effectiveness of his government, and sometimes the very fate of his dynasty. The degree to which various Chinese emperors throughout history actively and consciously manipulated or were passively overwhelmed by the complex dynamics of eunuch factionalism, and whether such factionalism was primarily a symptom of underlying dynastic weakness and poor imperial leadership or, in some cases, a direct contributing cause of it, is a recurring and much debated theme in the long and often dramatic historiography of imperial China. This internal political landscape, this constant, often hidden, jostling for position, resources, and influence among the eunuchs themselves, added yet another layer of profound complexity and ever-present danger to their already challenging and uniquely compromised lives. It meant that even as they toiled in service to the Son of Heaven, they also had to navigate the treacherous, shifting currents of their own highly competitive community, where a trusted brother today could become a bitter rival tomorrow, and where a careless word, a misjudged alliance, or a moment of political miscalculation could lead to a swift, silent, and often irreversible fall from grace. The secret lives of the imperial eunuchs were not just secret from the prying eyes of the outside world. They were often deeply secret from each other, shrouded in layers of carefully constructed ambition, pervasive fear, and meticulously guarded allegiances. We've now become somewhat accustomed to the shadowy, intricate world of the Forbidden City, understanding the painful paths that led individuals to become eunuchs, the rigorous training they endured, the complex hierarchies they navigated, their intimate service in the inner court, the immense political power some could wield, the temptations of wealth and corruption they faced, and even the subtle, dangerous dance of their internal factions and feuds. It's clear that the eunuch establishment was far from a monolithic entity composed of faceless servants. It was a vibrant, complex society teeming with individual ambitions, loyalties, and rivalries. And while the vast majority of the tens of thousands of eunuchs who served over the centuries remain anonymous figures, their lives unrecorded beyond perhaps a name on a payroll or a mention in a disciplinary report, a few managed to rise to such prominence or such infamy that their names have echoed down through the ages, leaving an indelible mark on the pages of Chinese history. Let's now gently meet a few of these famous shadows, noteworthy palace eunuchs whose lives illustrate the extraordinary spectrum of roles and impacts that individuals within this unique system could achieve. Our first, and perhaps most universally admired, famous eunuch is Zheng He, pronounced Yung Hu, who lived during the early Ming dynasty in the late 14th and early 15th centuries. His story is truly remarkable, challenging almost every stereotype one might have about palace-bound eunuchs. Several imperial eunuchs throughout Chinese history, such as the renowned Ming dynasty admiral and explorer Zheng He, or the exceptionally powerful and often notorious late Ming political figure Wei Zhongxian, wielded enormous, far-reaching influence, directly shaping not only court politics and palace administration, but also significant military, naval, and even international affairs. Zheng He is a prime example of the former, a figure of global historical importance. Zheng He was not born a Han Chinese. He was originally named Ma He, born around 1371 into a Hui Muslim family in Yunnan province, in the far southwest of China. His father and grandfather had even made the Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca. However, when Ma He was a young boy, Yunnan, then a Mongol holdout, was conquered by Ming imperial forces. He was captured, castrated as was sometimes the fate of young male captives in that era, and sent into the service of Zhu Di, the Prince of Yan, who was one of the sons of the Hongwu Emperor, the founder of the Ming dynasty. Ma He proved to be an exceptionally capable and loyal servant, distinguishing himself in the prince's military campaigns. When the Prince of Yan eventually usurped the throne and became the Yongle Emperor reigning from 1402 to 1424, one of the most dynamic and ambitious rulers in Chinese history, Ma, now renamed Zheng He, receiving the new surname Zheng in honor of his military achievements, rose to a position of great trust and prominence at court. The Yongle Emperor, eager to display China's power and glory to the world, and perhaps to establish new tributary relationships and trade routes, conceived of a series of unprecedented maritime expeditions, and he chose his trusted eunuch, Zheng He, to command them. Between 1405 and 1433, Zheng He led 7 epic voyages into the Indian Ocean, commanding vast treasure fleets by Ochuan that were unlike anything the world had seen before. These fleets consisted of hundreds of ships, including enormous multi-masted treasure ships that were reportedly over 400 feet long and 160 feet wide, though the exact dimensions are a subject of some scholarly debate. They were undoubtedly massive. These fleets carried tens of thousands of sailors, soldiers, officials, translators, and merchants. They sailed to Southeast Asia, India, the Persian Gulf, the Arabian Peninsula, and even down the east coast of Africa, reaching as far as modern-day Kenya and possibly even Mozambique. Imagine the sight of this immense armada appearing off the coast of some distant port. It must have been utterly astonishing. A floating city demonstrating the unimaginable power and wealth of the Ming Empire. Zheng He wasn't just an admiral, he was a diplomat, a trade envoy, and a symbol of Chinese imperial might. He presented gifts from the emperor, established diplomatic relations, suppressed piracy, and brought back exotic goods, animals including giraffes, which were seen as auspicious mythical creatures, much to the delight of the court, and envoys from dozens of foreign kingdoms to pay homage to the Son of Heaven. His voyages were triumphs of navigation, logistics, and cross-cultural diplomacy. Admiral Zheng He, the Yongle Emperor, might have instructed. Take these few hundred ships and these 27,000 men, and just pop over to Africa for a bit. Bring back a giraffe, some interesting spices, and try not to start any major intercontinental wars unless absolutely necessary. And make sure everyone knows who's in charge of the high seas these days. Good man. Zheng He's career demonstrates that eunuchs could be far more than just palace servants. They could be explorers, commanders, and figures of global significance. However, after the death of the Yongle Emperor and his immediate successor, the political winds at the Ming court shifted. The powerful Confucian scholar-official bureaucracy, always deeply suspicious of eunuch influence, and wary of the immense cost of these overseas expeditions, which they often saw as extravagant follies with little tangible benefit to the empire's agrarian heartland, gained the upper hand. The great voyages were discontinued. The fleet was largely dismantled, and China, for a time, turned inward. Zheng He himself died around 1433, likely during or shortly after his final voyage. His story remains a tantalizing what-if in world history. What if China had continued these voyages and become a dominant global maritime power centuries before the Europeans? Now, let's turn to a very different and far more infamous example from the later Ming dynasty. Wei Zhongxian, pronounced Wei Zhongxian, who lived from 1568 to 1627. If Zheng He represents the potential for eunuchs to achieve positive greatness, Wei Zhongxian embodies the darkest fears of the Confucian officials, the corrupt, tyrannical power eunuch who effectively usurped imperial authority and brought the dynasty to the brink of ruin. Wei rose from incredibly humble, even criminal beginnings. He was reportedly a gambler and ruffian who had himself castrated as an adult to escape debts and seek his fortune in the palace. Through a combination of cunning, ruthlessness, and an uncanny ability to ingratiate himself with key figures, particularly the wet nurse of the future Tianqi emperor who reigned 1620-1627. Wei Zhongxian steadily climbed the eunuch power ladder. When the young and largely disinterested Tianqi emperor ascended the throne, he was reportedly more interested in carpentry than in ruling. Wei Zhongxian, now in a position of immense personal trust, became the de facto ruler of China. He controlled access to the emperor, filled government positions with his corrupt cronies and sycophants, and ruthlessly persecuted his enemies, particularly the reform-minded scholar officials of the Donglin Academy faction, using the eunuch-led secret police agency, the Eastern Depot, as his instrument of terror. Corruption became rampant, taxes soared, and the administration of the empire fell into disarray. A quirky or fringe tidbit that illustrates the dizzying heights of his power and arrogance is that Wei Zhongxian allowed, and even encouraged, the construction of living shrines Shangqi dedicated to him throughout the empire, where officials and commoners were forced to pay him divine honors, a practice usually reserved for emperors or major deities. It was an act of almost unbelievable hubris. For a few years in the mid-1620s, Wei Zhongxian was arguably the most powerful man in China. his name inspiring more fear and loathing than that of the emperor himself. However, his reign of terror was relatively short-lived. When the Tianqi emperor died suddenly in 1627 and was succeeded by his younger brother, the Chongzhen emperor who was determined to curb eunuch power, Wei Zhongxian's downfall was swift and absolute. He was dismissed, accused of numerous crimes, and, facing certain execution, chose to commit suicide. The historical assessment of figures like Wei Zhongxian, whether he was an unmitigatedly evil and corrupt tyrant, as overwhelmingly portrayed by his victorious scholar official enemies in the historical records they subsequently wrote, or a more complex, if deeply flawed, figure whose actions must also be understood within the context of the severe factional struggles and systemic weaknesses of the late Ming court, continues to be reevaluated by some modern historians seeking a more nuanced perspective, though his reputation remains predominantly negative. Fast-forwarding to the very end of the Imperial era. During the late Qing dynasty, we encounter another highly influential eunuch, Li Lianying, pronounced Li Lianying, who lived from 1848 to 1911. Li became the trusted confidant and grand eunuch to the powerful Empress Dowager Cixi, who effectively ruled China for much of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Li Lianying was known for his intelligence, his discretion, and his unwavering loyalty to Cixi. He managed the vast imperial household, controlled access to the Empress Dowager, and was inevitably accused by Cixi's many political opponents of corruption, political meddling, and undue influence. However, he was also seen by some as a moderating influence on the often capricious Cixi, and he managed to navigate the incredibly turbulent and dangerous final decades of the Qing dynasty, surviving numerous court intrigues and political upheavals. Unlike many powerful eunuchs of the past, Li Lianying managed to retire with his wealth and his head intact, dying shortly before the dynasty itself collapsed. He represents a different kind of eunuch power, less about overt tyranny and more about intimate influence, careful management, and sheer political survival in a declining empire. These few examples, the heroic explorer Zheng He, the despotic Wei Zhongxian, the enduring confidant Li Lianying, only scratch the surface. But they illustrate the incredible range of secret lives and public impacts that imperial Chinese eunuchs could have. They were not just a faceless mass of servants. They were individuals who, within the unique and often brutal constraints of their existence, found ways to shape history, for better or for worse. Their whispers echoing from the deepest recesses of the Forbidden City out into the wider world. We've met some of the most famous and infamous figures from the eunuch establishment of imperial China, individuals like Zheng He, Wei Zhongxian, and Li Lianying, whose actions and influence reverberated far beyond the crimson walls of the Forbidden City. Their stories highlight the potential for eunuchs to achieve extraordinary power or amass great wealth. But what about their connections to the world outside those imposing palace gates? Despite their physical alteration, their vows of service to the emperor, and their often secluded lives within the imperial precinct, imperial eunuchs were not entirely cut off from the society whence they came. Many maintained or attempted to maintain ties with their birth families, accumulated personal property, and even forged unique, if unconventional, social links beyond the palace. Let's gently explore these outside ties. These often carefully managed and sometimes forbidden connections that tethered the inhabitants of the inner court to the wider world. For many young boys who underwent castration and entered palace service, the primary motivation, as we've discussed, was to support their impoverished birth families. This sense of filial duty, so deeply ingrained in Confucian culture, did not necessarily vanish once they passed through the Meridian Gate. Despite their lifelong service within the Forbidden City, many imperial eunuchs, when they achieved a position of some means or influence, endeavored to maintain ties with their birth families, often providing them with crucial financial support, gifts, or using their palace connections to secure advantages for their relatives. If a eunuch managed to save a portion of his meager stipend, or if he rose to a rank where he received more substantial allowances or gifts, he would often try to send money or valuable goods back to his parents and siblings in his home village. This could mean the difference between starvation and survival for his family, or perhaps allow them to buy a small plot of land, repair their humble home, or pay off crushing debts. The dream of alleviating his family's poverty was a powerful driving force for many a eunuch. Imagine the poignant scene: a senior eunuch, now clad in fine silks but forever marked by his sacrifice, discreetly arranging for a trusted messenger to carry a small purse of silver or a bolt of good cloth back to the distant village he had left as a boy. A village he might never see again? These family connections could be a source of comfort and a reminder of a life beyond the palace walls. But they could also be complicated. While a successful eunuch might bring honor and material benefit to his family, his inability to continue the ancestral line through biological children was a profound social and spiritual lack in traditional Chinese society. His family might be grateful for his support, but there would always be that underlying sense of his incompleteness, his sacrifice. Moreover, if a eunuch fell from power or was implicated in some palace intrigue, his family outside could also become vulnerable to reprisals. Within the palace itself, as we've touched upon, eunuchs created their own unique social structures to compensate for the lack of traditional family ties. The adoptive relationships between senior and junior eunuchs, forming eunuch fathers, sons, and even grandsons, created powerful pseudo-familial networks. These eunuch lineages provided mutual support, patronage for career advancement, a sense of belonging, and even a way to pass on accumulated wealth or property within the eunuch community. When a powerful eunuch died, his adopted eunuch son would often inherit his position. His wealth, if any, remained after imperial confiscations, which were common, and the leadership of his faction. This was their way of creating continuity and a form of posterity in a life that denied them biological descendants. What about personal property and wealth beyond what they might send to their birth families? High-ranking and influential eunuchs, particularly during dynasties like the Ming where their power was often unchecked, could amass considerable personal wealth through official salaries, imperial gifts, control over palace enterprises, and quite often, through bribery and corruption. Could they own property outside the Forbidden City? The rules and practices varied by dynasty and by the specific emperor's policies. In some periods, powerful eunuchs were indeed permitted to own lavish mansions in Beijing, outside the immediate palace complex, where they might retire in their old age, or which might serve as a base for their adopted families and extensive retinues. They could own landed estates in the countryside, managed by relatives or agents, providing them with agricultural income. They might invest in businesses, such as shops or pawn-broking establishments in the capital, often through intermediaries. The accumulation of such external wealth by eunuchs was a constant source of friction with the scholar official class, who saw it as evidence of corruption and an inappropriate encroachment by palace servants into the wider economy and society. Grand Eunuch Liang's new summer villa by the Western Hills is said to have a garden that rivals the emperor's own. A resentful official might grumble, "And I hear he paid for it entirely with unexpectedly successful investments in the Imperial silk spool requisition department." Shocking, I tell you. Shocking. Beyond these more formal connections, did eunuchs have what we might consider forbidden links, or a discreet social life outside their immediate duties? Again, this would depend greatly on their rank, their level of freedom, and the strictness of palace regulations at any given time. Lower-ranking eunuchs likely had very few opportunities to leave the Forbidden City or interact with outsiders. But higher-ranking eunuchs, especially those whose duties involved some interaction with the outer court or with merchants and suppliers, might have more chances. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some eunuchs, particularly in later dynasties like the Qing, engaged in marriages with palace maids gongnu. These were not, of course, sexual relationships in the conventional sense, nor could they produce children. However, they were often deep companionate partnerships, providing mutual emotional support, a semblance of domesticity, and a shared household, often just a small room or two within their designated palace quarters. The palace maid, or duishi paired eating partner, as they were sometimes called, might manage the eunuch's personal affairs, cook for him if he had separate rations or could afford extra food, and provide companionship in their old age. These relationships, though unconventional, highlight the enduring human need for connection and intimacy, even within the highly restrictive environment of the Forbidden City. There might also have been opportunities for some eunuchs to discreetly socialize outside the palace walls. Perhaps by obtaining leave to visit temples in Beijing, many eunuchs were devout Buddhists or Taoists and often patronized specific temples, or by frequenting certain tea houses, restaurants, or entertainment establishments in the city that were known to cater to palace staff. Such excursions would have been carefully managed and likely required permission, as unsupervised eunuch activity outside the palace was generally frowned upon and viewed with suspicion by both palace authorities and outer court officials. The fear was always that they might be engaging in political intrigue, illicit business dealings, or simply behavior deemed unseemly for imperial servants. The extent of genuine social interaction and meaningful integration between the majority of imperial eunuchs and the broader society of Beijing, beyond their official duties, their necessary transactions with merchants and suppliers, or the carefully managed support they might provide to their distant birth families, and how this changed across different dynasties and varied according to a eunuch's specific rank and influence, is a complex aspect of their secret lives that historians continue to piece together from varied and often indirect sources like personal memoirs rare for eunuchs, official records, and anecdotal accounts. For most, the Forbidden City was their entire world, an isolated island of imperial service. But for some, particularly the powerful and wealthy, the walls were perhaps a little more porous, allowing for carefully cultivated, if often still hidden, links to the bustling life of the city beyond the Vermilion Gates. These outside ties, whether to family, property, or discrete social networks, were another facet of their complex existence. A reminder that even within the most restrictive of institutions, human beings find ways to connect, to accumulate, and to seek a life beyond the immediate confines of their prescribed roles. The life of an imperial eunuch in the Forbidden City, as we've seen, was one of profound sacrifice, rigorous service, complex hierarchies, and for a select few, the potential for immense power and wealth. But what happened when these unique imperial servants grew old? When their strength began to fail, their eyesight dimmed, or they simply fell out of favor with a new emperor or a shifting palace faction? What did retirement look like for a eunuch? Their path into old age and towards the end of their lives was as varied and as dependent on rank, fortune, and imperial whim as every other aspect of their existence within those crimson walls. For some, it was a descent into poverty and neglect. For others, a carefully managed twilight in relative comfort, still within the orbit of the palace or in specially endowed religious institutions. Let's gently consider the twilight service and the often anxious retirement paths of these men who had given so much of themselves to the Dragon Throne. For the vast majority of low-ranking eunuchs, those who had spent their lives in menial labor, the endless cleaning, fetching, carrying, and guarding, old age often presented a bleak prospect. If they had not managed to attach themselves to a powerful senior eunuch adoptive father who might provide for them, or if they hadn't been able to squirrel away some meager savings, a difficult task on their tiny stipends, they could face a very harsh end. The imperial system, for all its grandeur, was not known for its generous pension plans or comprehensive social security for its lowest servants. The retirement and old age of imperial Chinese eunuchs varied enormously, starkly reflecting their rank, their accumulated wealth, if any, and the degree of imperial favor they had managed to maintain throughout their careers. Some high-ranking and wealthy eunuchs retired to lives of considerable comfort and continued, if diminished, influence, often within specially endowed Buddhist or Taoist temples that catered to their community, while many more lower-ranking eunuchs likely faced old age with the grim prospects of poverty, neglect, and isolation once their ability to perform strenuous palace duties waned. When a low-ranking eunuch became too old or too infirm to perform his duties effectively, he might simply be dismissed from active service with little or no provision. Some might be allowed to remain within the less critical, more remote parts of the vast Forbidden City complex, perhaps assigned to extremely light duties like tending a forgotten corner of a garden or guarding an infrequently used gate, essentially living out their days as pensioners of the palace, receiving basic rations but little else. Others, if they had no strong connections or patrons within the palace, might be allowed, or even encouraged, to leave the Forbidden City altogether. This presented a huge problem. Where would they go? Returning to their birth families was often not a viable option. Decades might have passed since they left their native villages. Their parents and siblings might be long dead, or their families, still impoverished, might be unable or unwilling to support an aged, non-productive relative who also carried the social stigma of being a eunuch. Some of these elderly, destitute eunuchs ended up in Buddhist or Taoist monasteries or temples outside the palace walls that had a tradition of offering shelter and care to their own kind, often funded by donations from more successful, wealthier eunuchs. These religious institutions became, in effect, the first retirement homes and hospices for the eunuch community. For high-ranking and wealthy eunuchs, however, the picture of old age and retirement could be quite different. Those who had successfully navigated the treacherous currents of palace politics, amassed considerable personal fortunes through legitimate means or, more often, through the various avenues of corruption we've discussed, and who had cultivated powerful patrons or adopted loyal eunuch sons to look after their interests, could often look forward to a much more comfortable and secure twilight service or retirement. They might be granted permission to reside in spacious and well-appointed private apartments within designated areas of the Forbidden City, even after they had formally retired from their most demanding official duties. Here, they could live out their days in relative luxury, attended by their own retinue of younger eunuch servants, often their adopted sons or grandsons, managing their investments, perhaps pursuing hobbies like calligraphy, painting, or gardening, or simply enjoying the status and deference that came with their past power. Some might retain a degree of informal influence, their advice still sought by active eunuchs or even by members of the imperial family who remembered their long service. A common path for wealthy and devout retired eunuchs was to lavishly endow a Buddhist or Taoist temple or monastery, often with the understanding that they would be able to retire there in comfort and be properly cared for in their final years. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that there were several specific temples in and around Beijing, such as the Tianixi Temple of Heavenly Tranquility with its ancient and beautiful pagoda, or the Faiwanzi Temple of the Source of Dharma, that became particularly well known as favored retirement spots for imperial eunuchs throughout the Ming and Qing dynasties. These temples often had special halls, courtyards, or living quarters specifically built for and maintained by retired eunuchs, where they could live out their final years in a communal, religious setting, engage in Buddhist or Taoist practices, and, importantly, ensure that their funerary rites and the proper care of their precious bayo, their preserved genitals, essential for their hopes of a complete rebirth, would be attended to according to custom. These eunuch temple retirement communities were unique social institutions, a world within a world, providing a final refuge for men who had lived lives unlike any other. Brother Liu. One elderly retired eunuch might say to another as they take a slow stroll through a temple garden they helped to fund, "Do you remember that dreadful incident with the Yongle Emperor's prize-winning carp and the mislabeled fish food? Those were the days of high stress and low pay. Now it's just peaceful contemplation and trying to remember where I buried my treasure for safekeeping, and hoping the abbot doesn't serve that watery congee again for supper." Regardless of rank or wealth, certain anxieties likely accompanied eunuchs into their old age. The long-term physical consequences of castration could become more pronounced, including increased risk of osteoporosis, urinary tract problems, incontinence, infections, strictures, and other health issues. The psychological toll of a life lived in such an artificial, high-pressure, and often emotionally barren environment might also manifest in later years. And the deep cultural fear of dying alone, far from one's ancestral home, and without direct descendants to perform the essential ancestral rites and ensure the well-being of one's spirit in the afterlife, would have been a heavy burden for many, even if their adopted eunuch sons took on some of these ritual responsibilities. The importance of their bio, their treasure, would become even more acute as death approached. Ensuring that it was safely kept and that it would be correctly placed with their body at the time of burial, often in a specially constructed coffin that might have a small compartment for it, was a matter of profound spiritual significance. Without their bayo, they faced the terrifying prospect of being incomplete in the underworld, unable to be reborn as a whole man, and perhaps doomed to wander as a lonely, unfulfilled ghost. The degree of organized state or institutional support formerly provided by the imperial system for elderly or infirm eunuchs, beyond what they could secure through their own accumulated personal wealth. Their position within the eunuch hierarchy, or the benevolence of their adopted eunuch family networks and religious patronage, and how this level of support might have evolved or differed significantly across the various Chinese dynasties, is an area where detailed historical records are not always comprehensive or consistent. For the most part, it seems that eunuchs were expected to provide for their own old age, or to rely on the informal support systems within their own unique community. The imperial dragon, having been served for a lifetime, did not always have a soft spot for its aging, non-procreative servants once their primary utility had passed. Their twilight years, like so much of their lives, were a complex mixture of privilege for a few and precarious uncertainty for the many. The institution of imperial eunuchs, that unique and often deeply controversial feature of Chinese imperial governance, endured for over 2 millennia, weathering dynastic changes, peasant rebellions, foreign invasions, and profound cultural shifts. From the earliest dynasties shrouded in legend right through to the dawn of the 20th century, these physically altered men served at the very heart of imperial power. But like all human institutions, however deeply entrenched, it too eventually faced its twilight and its end. The decline and fall of the eunuch system was not a sudden event, but a gradual erosion culminating in its final dissolution with the collapse of the Qing dynasty, the last imperial house to rule China. Let's gently witness this system's sunset, the fading away of these once ubiquitous and often immensely powerful figures from the stage of Chinese history. Throughout the Qing dynasty, 1644-1912, which was founded by Manchu conquerors from the northeast, the role and power of eunuchs continued, though often with more attempts at control and restriction by the emperors, compared to some of the more notorious periods of eunuch dominance in the preceding Ming dynasty. The early Qing rulers, having studied the history of their predecessors and keenly aware of the dangers of unchecked eunuch influence, which was often blamed for contributing to the Ming's downfall, implemented stricter regulations regarding eunuch numbers, their involvement in state affairs, and their ability to hold positions of power in the outer court bureaucracy. However, eunuchs remained absolutely essential for the functioning of the vast inner court, for the personal service of the emperor and his extensive family, and for managing the intricate daily life of the Forbidden City. Figures like Li Lianying, whom we met earlier, the powerful and deeply trusted grand eunuch to the Empress Dowager Cixi in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, demonstrate that even under Qing rule, individual eunuchs could still achieve immense personal influence and wealth, albeit perhaps more through subtle, behind-the-scenes maneuvering than through overt control of state agencies as had sometimes occurred in the Ming. The numbers of eunuchs employed during the Qing were generally lower than at the height of the Ming, perhaps averaging between 2,000 to 3,000, but they remained a significant and indispensable part of the imperial household right up to its final days. The true death knell for the imperial eunuch system sounded with the fall of the Qing dynasty itself. The Xinhai Revolution of 1911 led to the overthrow of millennia of imperial rule and the establishment of the Republic of China in 1912. The last emperor, the child Puyi, was allowed to abdicate but initially permitted to continue living within the northern part of the Forbidden City with a skeletal imperial household, a strange anachronistic bubble of imperial tradition within a rapidly modernizing republic. For a time, a diminished core of eunuchs continued to serve him and the remaining imperial family members in this reduced capacity. However, their world was shrinking, their purpose becoming increasingly obsolete. The final, definitive end came in 1924, when a warlord, Feng Yuxiang, seeking to consolidate his power and remove what he saw as a lingering symbol of feudalism, expelled the young former emperor Puyi and his entire household, including all remaining eunuchs and palace maids, from the Forbidden City. This event brought the centuries-long imperial occupation of the palace to an abrupt and unceremonious close, and with it, the practical existence of the imperial eunuch system. The imperial eunuch system in China, which had been an integral feature of imperial governance and palace life for over 2 millennia, effectively came to a definitive end with the collapse of the Qing dynasty in 1912 and the subsequent expulsion of the last emperor, Puyi, from the Forbidden City in 1924. This momentous political upheaval led to the dispersal and destitution of most of the remaining imperial eunuchs. What was the fate of these last imperial eunuchs, suddenly thrust out of the only world many of them had ever known it was? For most, a deeply tragic and difficult one. They were often old men by this time, their lives having been entirely dedicated to palace service. They possessed few, if any, skills suited for survival in the rapidly changing, often chaotic, outside world of early Republican China. They had no families in the traditional sense to fall back on, their adoptive eunuch family networks within the palace having been shattered. They faced widespread social scorn and discrimination, viewed by many in the New Republic as embarrassing and corrupt relics of a despised imperial past. Many found themselves impoverished, homeless, and reliant on charity or the meager support of a few remaining Buddhist or Taoist temples that had traditionally offered them refuge. Imagine these men, who had once walked the gilded corridors of power, perhaps served tea to empresses or whispered advice to princes, now reduced to begging on the streets of Beijing or living out their final days in cold, forgotten temple corners. It was a harsh and poignant end to a life of profound sacrifice. Well, that's that then. One aging, newly unemployed eunuch might have sighed to another as they were herded out of the gate of divine might. Turns out expert in kowtowing and distinguishing between 17 shades of imperial yellow silk isn't a transferable skill in this new republic thingamajig. Anyone know a good monastery that still serves decent kanji? A quirky or fringe tidbit is that Sun Yaoting, who passed away in 1996 at the age of 94, is generally considered to have been the last surviving imperial eunuch from the Qing dynasty. He had entered palace service as a young boy and served the last emperor, Puyi, and other members of the imperial family. In his later years after the Communist Revolution, he lived a quiet life and eventually became something of a historical curiosity, his memories and experiences providing invaluable, if often sad and fragmented, first-hand insights into the final, fading years of this ancient and unique institution. His life story, documented by historians and journalists, offers a poignant human face to the end of this 2,000-year-old tradition. The official abolition of the practice of castration for the purpose of creating palace servants came with the end of the imperial system. The new republic had no need for such a class of individuals. The social conditions of extreme poverty that had driven so many families to make that desperate choice also began to change, albeit slowly, with modernization. The world that had created and sustained the imperial eunuch was gone. The socio-economic impact and personal experiences of these displaced imperial eunuchs in the early Republican period, following their expulsion from the familiar, if deeply flawed, world of the Forbidden City, and the extent of any organized state or private charitable efforts to provide for them in their old age and destitution, is a relatively understudied but profoundly human aspect of this major historical transition in China. They were, in many ways, the forgotten casualties of a revolution, their unique lives and sacrifices rendered obsolete by the relentless march of history. The system's sunset was not a glorious blaze, but more of a slow, sad, and ultimately inevitable fading into the twilight. The crimson walls of the Forbidden City would eventually be opened to the public as a museum, its treasures and secrets put on display. But the silent, gliding steps of its once ubiquitous eunuch inhabitants would echo no more through its vast, empty courtyards, their secret lives becoming just another chapter in the long, complex, and often boring but always fascinating history of China. Our long, sleepy sojourn through the crimson walls and shadowy corridors of the Forbidden City, exploring the secret lives of the imperial Chinese eunuchs, is now drawing to its final, contemplative close. We've witnessed their painful entry into service, navigated their complex hierarchies, observed their meticulous daily routines, peeked into their unique position as guardians of the inner court, understood their potential for immense power and also for profound corruption, glimpsed their hidden personal worlds, and finally watched as their ancient institution slowly faded into history with the fall of the last dynasty. As the image of these enigmatic figures begins to soften and recede into the mists of time, what is their enduring legacy? How should we remember these men who made such an extraordinary sacrifice and lived such unparalleled lives at the very heart of Chinese imperial power? It's time to try and unveil some of the layers of their complex and often deeply misunderstood historical significance. One of the most immediate things to consider is their portrayal in traditional Chinese history, which has, for the most part, been overwhelmingly negative. The historical perception of imperial Chinese eunuchs has often been profoundly shaped by the inherent biases of the Confucian scholar officials who were their primary political rivals, and who also authored the vast majority of the official dynastic histories and other influential texts. From a strict Confucian viewpoint, eunuchs were often seen as an unnatural and undesirable element within the state. They were considered incomplete men, cut off from the vital Confucian duty of producing heirs to continue the family line and ancestral rights. Their close proximity to the emperor and the imperial family, particularly the women of the inner court, was viewed with deep suspicion as a source of potential moral corruption and undue political influence. Consequently, in many historical accounts, powerful eunuchs are frequently depicted as sycophantic, greedy, power-hungry, manipulative, and a primary cause of dynastic weakness, corruption, and even eventual collapse. Figures like Wei Zhongxian in the Ming Dynasty became archetypal villains, symbols of everything that could go wrong when eunuchs were allowed to wield excessive power. This predominantly negative narrative has, for centuries, shaped both scholarly and popular understanding of imperial eunuchs. However, modern historical scholarship has sought to achieve a more nuanced and balanced understanding, looking beyond these often one-sided traditional accounts. While the instances of eunuch corruption and destructive political meddling are undeniable and well documented, it's also crucial to recognize the immense diversity of eunuch experiences and roles. Not all eunuchs were power-hungry tyrants. The vast majority, as we've seen, were ordinary servants performing essential, if often grueling and thankless, daily tasks that kept the vast machinery of the imperial household functioning. Many were undoubtedly loyal, diligent, and dedicated to their duties, serving their imperial masters with a devotion born of their unique circumstances and their complete dependence on the palace system for their very survival. Furthermore, some eunuchs, as exemplified by the remarkable Admiral Zheng He of the Ming Dynasty, achieved greatness not just within the palace walls but on the world stage, demonstrating extraordinary capabilities as commanders, diplomats, and explorers. Others were skilled administrators who managed vast palace departments with efficiency, or talented artists, musicians, and craftsmen who contributed to the rich cultural life of the imperial court. To paint all eunuchs with the same brush of corruption and infamy is to ignore the complexity and variety of their secret lives and their contributions. The secret aspect of their lives also extends to our often limited understanding of their inner thoughts, their personal emotions, and their true sense of identity. Because most historical records concerning eunuchs were written by outsiders, often hostile scholar officials, or by missionaries with their own agendas. And because personal memoirs or diaries written by eunuchs themselves are exceptionally rare, though a few fascinating examples and collections of letters do exist, particularly from later periods, it is incredibly difficult to fully reconstruct their subjective experiences. What did it truly feel like to live such a life? To have made such a profound physical sacrifice? To be cut off from conventional family life? To exist in a world of such intense hierarchy, ritual, and political intrigue? To wield immense power one day and face utter ruin the next? Their deepest joys, sorrows, fears, and hopes are often obscured from our view, lost in the silent corridors of the Forbidden City. Reconciling the often contradictory historical narratives surrounding imperial eunuchs, their portrayal as corrupt political meddlers and palace intriguers versus their equally documented roles as loyal personal servants, skilled administrators, devoted religious patrons, or even figures of significant cultural or national achievement, remains a central challenge for historians seeking a balanced, empathetic, and nuanced understanding of this unique and long-lived institution. What can studying the lives of imperial eunuchs teach us today as we drift off to sleep? Perhaps it offers a profound, if sometimes unsettling, meditation on the nature of power, how it can be sought and wielded in the most unlikely of circumstances, and how it can corrupt even those who may have entered service with more humble intentions. It certainly tells us a great deal about the extreme social and economic inequalities that can exist within a society, and the desperate choices that individuals or families might make when faced with overwhelming poverty or a lack of other opportunities. It also illuminates the complex interplay of gender, sexuality, and social roles, as eunuchs occupied a unique liminal space that challenged conventional definitions of masculinity and family, yet were created and defined by a deeply patriarchal system, obsessed with controlling female chastity and ensuring patrilineal succession. Their story is also one of human resilience, of the ability of individuals to adapt, to form their own unique social structures like the adoptive eunuch families, and to find meaning and purpose even within the most restrictive and physically compromising of circumstances. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that in modern China, there has been a growing academic and even some popular cultural interest in re-examining the history of imperial eunuchs, moving beyond the old, often one-dimensional stereotypes to understand their complex social, political, and cultural significance. There are museums dedicated to eunuch history like the Tianyi Eunuch Museum in Beijing, located in a former eunuch temple, scholarly conferences, and new historical research that seeks to provide a more multifaceted perspective on their lives and their role in China's long imperial past. The silent shadows are gradually, if slowly, being given a more complex voice. The boring history aspect of their lives, which we've tried to emphasize, is also a crucial takeaway. For all the tales of high drama, political intrigue, and imperial splendor or squalor, much of the existence of most eunuchs was likely characterized by routine, repetitive labor, and the meticulous observance of endless protocols. It was in the boring daily grind of cleaning, serving, guarding, and administering that they truly kept the Forbidden City alive. Their secret lives were not always filled with grand schemes or whispered conspiracies. Often, they were filled with the quiet, unglamorous, and absolutely essential work of imperial service. As we finally let the image of these enigmatic figures fade into the peaceful darkness of our own night, let us remember them not just as caricatures of corruption or as powerless victims, but as complex human beings who lived extraordinary, often tragic, and profoundly influential lives at the very heart of one of history's most enduring empires. Their story is a poignant reminder of the diverse and often hidden paths that individuals have navigated throughout history, and the enduring enigma of lives lived out in the shadow of immense power. And so, our long and winding passage through the Forbidden City and into the secret lives of the imperial eunuchs who served within its crimson walls gently comes to its final, sleepy close. We have walked in their silent footsteps, from the painful choice that set them on their unique path, through the years of rigorous training, the daily grind of service, the intricate hierarchies, the proximity to unimaginable power, the temptations of wealth, the solace of their hidden personal worlds, the dangers of factional intrigue, and finally, to the fading twilight of their ancient institution. As the grand halls and secluded courtyards of the Forbidden City begin to dissolve in your mind, replaced by the familiar comfort of your own quiet room, allow the complex story of these imperial servants to settle, their joys and sorrows, their ambitions and fears, their sacrifices and their legacies. These can all now recede, like figures disappearing down a long, shadowy corridor, leaving behind only a sense of quiet understanding and perhaps a touch of historical empathy. There are no more imperial schedules to keep tonight, no more intricate courtly protocols to observe, only the gentle, natural rhythm of your own breathing, guiding you effortlessly towards deep and peaceful rest. Let any lingering thoughts of emperors, concubines, or eunuchs become like distant, fading drumbeats, lulling your mind into a state of serene tranquility. The Forbidden City, with all its secrets and all its silenced voices, now sleeps. And so, too, shall you? May your dreams be filled with peace, and your rest be profound and deeply restorative. Sweet dreams.